The rain began as a whisper, soft drops pattering on thatched roofs, turning dirt paths into slick, muddy trails. Villagers looked up at the sky with unease, shrugging off the early showers as an ordinary inconvenience. But soon, the whispers of rain grew into a deafening roar. Rivers swelled as if possessed, spilling over their banks, swallowing crops and livestock with unstoppable fury. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Smoke from hearth fires twisted into the gray sky, vanishing in the sheets of water that poured down. Entire fields were gone in hours, turned into churning lakes where only the tallest trees broke the surface. No one could have imagined that the flood would not discriminate. Rich and poor, farmer and noble, child and elder. Everyone stood equally powerless before the onslaught. The very ground seemed to tremble beneath the relentless surge, and whispers of panic spread through the villages. Boats were hastily crafted from timber, patched with reeds and mud, yet they offered little protection against a flood that seemed to have a mind of its own. People clung to debris, struggling to survive as waters rose to swallow homes whole. It was a scene of chaos and despair, but also, remarkably, a testament to human resilience. Mothers shielded their children, husbands carried their wives, and neighbors risked their lives to save strangers. In the midst of this natural catastrophe, questions arose that no one could answer. How had the waters risen so fast, so violently? Was this the wrath of the gods, punishment for sins committed long ago, or merely the capricious cruelty of nature? Some elders muttered of old stories, floods that had come before, floods that had reshaped the world. Their warnings had been dismissed as superstition, yet now their tales seemed terrifyingly prescient. The villagers watched as familiar landmarks disappeared under a growing sea of brown water, the river carving a new path where none had existed before. It was as if the world they knew was being rewritten, leaving only uncertainty and fear in its wake. Amid the panic, a few people noticed strange patterns in the rising waters. Debris floated in peculiar arrangements, almost as if forming lines or clusters, and the wind carried an eerie stillness between gusts of rain. Some claimed to see shapes in the clouds, monstrous and foreboding, as though the heavens themselves were observing the unfolding disaster. These were not just idle fears. They were instincts honed by generations who remembered older floods, older stories, older warnings. There was a sense, almost instinctual, that this was more than a storm. Something ancient had awakened, and it had chosen this moment to reveal itself. Survivors clung to the highest points. Hilltops, the remains of crumbling temples, the skeletal remains of structures too frail to withstand the waters. From these vantage points, they saw the full scale of the catastrophe. Entire villages were gone. Forests had been uprooted and carried like toys in the turbulent waters. Smoke and ash mingled with the rain, a bitter perfume of destruction that stung the lungs and eyes. Even the animals seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, fleeing in large, panicked herds or drowning where escape was impossible. It was a theater of both horror and awe, a reminder of the delicate balance of life and how quickly it could be overturned. And yet, amid despair, a flicker of hope persisted. Families huddled together, forming makeshift rafts from the remnants of their homes. Strangers became allies in the struggle to survive, helping one another navigate the treacherous currents. Every rescue, every small triumph, felt monumental against the backdrop of overwhelming destruction. It was in these moments that the human spirit shone brightest, a fragile light in a world swallowed by darkness. The flood, unstoppable and indifferent, had become a crucible, testing courage, loyalty, and the will to endure. But questions remained, gnawing at the minds of those who survived the first night. How had this disaster come to be? Could it happen again? Were the stories whispered in the fireside myths of old warnings? Or were they echoes of a real past, long forgotten? As the waters raged on, swallowing familiar landmarks and leaving only chaos in their wake, the seeds of a profound mystery took root. Across rivers, valleys, and continents, people would recount the events, crafting tales that blurred the line between history and legend. It was the beginning of a story that would transcend generations, a story of survival, divine wrath, and a delicate thread of humanity standing against the fury of nature. In the end, the first survivors emerged, drenched and exhausted, gazing at a world they barely recognized. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, yet they carried within them the beginnings of a tale that would echo through millennia. A tale not just of water and destruction, but of warning, memory, and the unyielding drive to survive. As they clutched their few possessions and looked to the horizon, the question lingered like a shadow over the floodwaters. Was this just a storm, or had something deeper, older, and almost unimaginable been unleashed upon the world? The waters would recede, as all waters eventually do, but the mystery of the flood, the sheer, almost supernatural scale, the whispers of ancient warnings, would linger. And somewhere, deep in human memory, the stories were already taking shape, waiting to be told again, across generations, across continents, as if the flood itself had imprinted on the human soul. Long after the waters receded and the first survivors stumbled onto new, reshaped land, whispers of the flood began to echo through the generations. Stories were told in hushed tones beside dying embers, in the soft rustle of leaves by rivers that had once swallowed entire villages. These were not just tales of rain and destruction. They carried a weight far greater than any ordinary storm. They spoke of a world forever altered, a reminder of forces beyond human comprehension, forces that seemed to follow patterns too precise, too universal to be mere coincidence. Scholars today call these echoes flood myths, but for those who first uttered them, they were warnings, memories, and prayers intertwined. In the cradle of civilization, Sumerian scribes etched cuneiform into clay tablets, long before ink or paper had been invented. Their lines were not merely records. They were attempts to preserve memory against time itself. The Eridu flood tablet tells of kings and gods, of waters consuming lands and people, and of a lone man chosen to survive. Across the Fertile Crescent, the Babylonian epic of Atrahasis recounts a similar tale, one in which the gods, angered by humanity's noise and rebellion, unleash a deluge. Here, the flood is more than a natural event. It becomes a narrative of divine judgment, morality, and survival. What strikes the modern observer is not just the similarity of events, but the uncanny resonance. Across separate cities, empires, and languages, the pattern repeats, as if these distant civilizations shared a common memory. Even as scribes wrote, oral traditions flourished. In villages far from the centers of empires, elders spoke of monstrous rains, rivers that devoured homes, and survivors chosen by fate or divine favor. These tales often shifted with each telling, shaped by local culture and belief, yet their essence remained intact. Water rising with unstoppable force, humanity facing annihilation, and a few brave souls carrying life into a new world. It was as if the human mind, when confronted by extreme catastrophe, instinctively encoded it in story, ensuring it would be remembered long after physical evidence had vanished. The pattern was not limited to Mesopotamia. In the mountains of India, Vedic texts recorded Manu's encounter with a great flood, guided by a mystical fish who warned him of the coming waters. Far to the east, Chinese chronicles speak of a titanic deluge tamed only through heroic labor and ingenuity. Even in lands seemingly untouched by these empires, Native American tribes recounted floods of unimaginable scale, rivers carving new valleys, and mountains swallowed beneath temporary seas. The scope is staggering. Independent cultures, separated by thousands of miles and generations, recounting disasters that share a nearly identical structure. This cannot be mere coincidence. And yet, there's another layer, subtler, but no less compelling. In these myths, the flood is rarely random. It carries a purpose. It is punishment for hubris, a cleansing of corruption, a test of obedience or courage. Some stories cast the survivors as morally superior, chosen to inherit the world new. Others depict the waters as impartial, striking indiscriminately, testing the resilience of humanity itself. Here, in the interplay between catastrophe and morality, between survival and judgment, these myths begin to reveal a profound truth. Floods were not just physical events. They were mirrors of the human condition, reflecting fear, hope, guilt, and the instinct for endurance. Archaeology has long supported these stories, though not always in ways easily understood. Layers of sediment reveal sudden rises in water levels. Drowned settlements hint at sudden destruction, and fossilized remains of animals suggest mass migrations or catastrophic die-offs. It is as if the Earth itself preserves a memory of these events, coated in rock, soil, and bone. Ancient storytellers may have sensed this memory, even if they could not fully explain it. Their myths, passed down through generations, became a bridge between observed reality and the unknowable forces behind it. But it is the repetition, the echo of the flood across cultures, that demands attention. Why do Sumerian scribes, Vedic priests, and Native American elders all describe similar sequences of events? Warning, divine or mystical intervention, construction of a survival vessel, the destruction of the old world, and the rebirth of life. Is it a coincidence or evidence of a shared, global experience etched into human consciousness? Modern scholars debate endlessly, yet the parallels are undeniable, hinting at a hidden truth that refuses to be ignored. Even more intriguing is the role of memory and imagination in shaping these accounts. Each storyteller added their own interpretations, moral lessons, and cultural markers, yet they preserve the essential narrative. The result is a tapestry of myth, layered with history, human psychology, and possibly memory of real events. When the next generation listens to these stories, they inherit more than a warning. They inherit a coded memory of disaster, resilience, and survival. In this way, flood myths became both warning and guide, teaching humans not only how to survive nature's fury, but also how to confront their own fears and morality. As night falls over the lands where these floods were first remembered, it is easy to imagine the terrified faces of those who witnessed them. Their survival was not just physical, it was cultural, intellectual, and spiritual. By telling the stories, by etching them in clay or reciting them by firelight, they ensured that the flood would live far beyond the lifetime of any single person. And as centuries passed, the echoes of these stories grew louder, spreading across empires, oceans, and generations. Each retelling preserved the terror, the awe, and the hope, ensuring that the mystery of the flood would never be forgotten. The stage is now set for the modern mind to ponder. What if these stories are more than allegory? What if they are fragments of a shared human memory, traces of real events that shaped the course of civilizations? And what if, hidden beneath the layers of myth, theology, and cultural interpretation, lies a truth so profound it challenges everything we think we know about our past? The journey to uncover that truth begins here, in the echoes of antiquity, where the flood first whispered its terrifying, unforgettable tale. As the stories of floods echoed across civilizations, one theme began to stand out: the vessel that carried humanity through the deluge. Across continents, from Mesopotamia to India, from Greece to the Americas, myth spoke of an ark, a boat, or a raft, a fragile salvation amid unstoppable chaos. These vessels were more than wooden constructions. They were symbols of hope, ingenuity, and the desperate will to survive. They carried the chosen, the innocent, and often the animals, ensuring that life would endure when the waters finally receded. But why did this motif appear so consistently across peoples separated by thousands of miles and untold generations? In Sumer, the Epic of Gilgamesh recounts Utnapishtim's boat, meticulously built according to divine instructions, a cube-like vessel designed to withstand the wrath of the gods. Utnapishtim gathers his family, the seeds of life, and every species of animal, sealing them within a floating sanctuary as the flood sweeps the land. The imagery is vivid: towering waves, darkened skies, the roar of destruction, and a lonely figure navigating the storm with unwavering determination. It is a story of both fear and triumph, of human ingenuity guided by wisdom beyond mortal understanding. The ark is not merely wood and rope. It is a lifeline between destruction and rebirth, a testament to foresight, courage, and survival instinct. Thousands of miles away and centuries later, the Hebrew Bible tells of Noah's Arkansas. Here, too, divine warning comes before the flood, giving Noah precise instructions on the construction of a massive vessel. He gathers his family, pairs of every animal, and provisions enough to weather 40 days and nights of relentless rain. As the waters rise, the ark becomes a sanctuary, a floating microcosm of life preserved amid global annihilation. The story emphasizes morality. Humanity's corruption provoked divine wrath, yet obedience and righteousness offered salvation. The ark, in this sense, is both physical and symbolic, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. In India, the Vedic texts recount Manu's encounter with a great fish, which warns him of a coming flood that will destroy the world. Guided by the fish, Manu constructs a boat and survives, carrying the seeds of life and the wisdom necessary to rebuild civilization. The vessel itself is almost secondary to the guidance and foresight that ensure survival. This story adds another layer to the motif. Survival is not only about preparation, but also about heeding warning, trusting guidance, and acting decisively in the face of impending disaster. Across all these myths, the ark or boat embodies both material ingenuity and the moral or spiritual readiness to confront catastrophe. Even more fascinating are the variations in the construction of these arks. Some are cube-like, some rectangular, some enormous, others small and fragile. Some float on rivers, others on vast seas. Some are guided by divine beings, others by mystical creatures. Yet the essence remains the same: a vessel that protects life, a space where humans and animals endure while the world outside succumbs. Scholars have long noted the parallels, suggesting that these similarities point to either a shared memory of catastrophic floods or a deeply ingrained archetype in the human psyche. The ark is more than a story element. It is a universal symbol of hope, adaptation, and survival. Archaeological evidence adds an eerie dimension. In some regions, ancient civilizations built flood-resistant structures, raised platforms, and even early dams. These physical traces hint that some floods may not have been purely mythical. The design of the arks described in texts, while often symbolic, could reflect real knowledge of buoyancy, stability, and materials, encoded into stories that would survive millennia. Could it be that ancient humans, witnessing extreme floods, transmitted survival knowledge through myth, disguising engineering principles in divine narratives? The ark might then be both a spiritual symbol and a practical manual, a lifeline hidden within allegory. The ark also embodies human emotions in extremis. Fear, hope, desperation, and courage converge within the confined space of the vessel. Families cling to each other, animals whimper and stir, storms rage on every side, and yet life endures. This emotional resonance explains why the motif persists. It captures the human experience of catastrophe in a way that mere description of storms or rains cannot. Every narrative of an ark, across time and geography, evokes the tension between vulnerability and resilience, terror and hope. It is a story of humanity tested against forces far beyond comprehension, yet refusing to succumb. Some myths take the motif even further. In Greek legend, Deucalion builds a chest to survive Zeus's flood, while in Native American lore, various tribes describe boats or canoes carrying families and animals through cataclysmic waters. Even in distant Pacific islands, tales exist of massive storms and rescue vessels that preserve life. The ubiquity is striking. Independently, cultures everywhere conceived a vessel that would shield the worthy from annihilation. This recurring theme hints at something universal in human cognition, the instinct to preserve life, paired with imagination that transforms danger into narrative, horror into hope. And yet, there's a subtle question that lingers, one that scholars and storytellers alike cannot ignore. Were these vessels purely metaphorical, or do they reflect real events, witnessed and encoded into memory? Could some ancient civilization, or multiple civilizations, have faced an actual cataclysm, compelling humans to invent extraordinary means of survival? And if so, what else has been lost beneath the waters, hidden in time and sediment, waiting to surface in myths and discoveries alike? The Ark becomes not just a story of survival, but a symbol of humanity's persistent effort to understand, endure, and transcend catastrophe. By the end of the mythic journey, the Ark is no longer just a vessel. It is a bridge between destruction and creation, between divine judgment and human action, between memory and imagination. It is the embodiment of the universal human hope that even in the face of obliteration, life, morality, and knowledge can endure. And as we explore the rest of the world's flood myths, the Ark will appear again and again, reminding us that survival is not accidental, but the product of courage, foresight, and sometimes divine or mystical guidance. While myths told of arks and divine warnings, the earth itself seemed to keep its own record of the floods, silent, patient, and immutable. Archaeologists and geologists have uncovered astonishing evidence suggesting that cataclysmic floods were more than mere legend. Sediment layers, ancient riverbeds, and drowned cities point to sudden, immense surges of water, leaving behind physical scars that align in astonishing ways with the stories passed down for millennia. In places like Mesopotamia, thick deposits of silt and clay suggest a massive deluge once swept the land, transforming fertile plains into barren mudflats. These remnants are the whispers of history, buried but never forgotten, waiting for modern eyes to decipher them. Underneath the earth, archaeologists have discovered cities that seem to have vanished overnight. Uruk, and Eridu in Mesopotamia bear traces of sudden abandonment, their foundations drenched in flood sediments. Ancient tools, pottery, and human remains suggest life was abruptly interrupted, a civilization caught unprepared by forces beyond its understanding. Even the layout of these cities, the raised platforms, drainage systems, and fortified structures, hints that people had experienced dangerous floods before, that they had tried, in their own way, to adapt. Yet no preparation could withstand the fury of a truly cataclysmic event. It is almost as if the earth itself was testing humanity, recording our resilience, ingenuity, and vulnerability in soil and stone. Evidence is not limited to Mesopotamia. In the Persian Gulf, studies suggest that rising post-Ice Age seas may have submerged entire settlements, hinting at catastrophic sea level changes thousands of years ago. Along the shores of the Black Sea, layers of freshwater overlying saltwater indicate a sudden influx from the Mediterranean, potentially flooding vast areas and displacing populations. These natural events mirror the timelines of myths across the world, as if the earth itself provided the narrative seeds that humans would later encode in story. The intersection of myth and archaeology is uncanny. The earth remembers, even when human memory fades. Some of the most haunting discoveries are the remains of entire communities preserved in the sudden violence of floods. Tools and artifacts lie in situ, as if their owners simply vanished. Skeletal remains show signs of sudden death, hinting at panic, struggle, and desperation. Fossilized animals tell a parallel story, with mass die-off suggesting that no species was immune to the forces of water and sediment. These findings give the myths a terrifying authenticity, a tangible reminder that the flood was not only metaphorical, it was literal. When humans faced the waters, they faced a power beyond comprehension, a force that could erase entire ways of life in hours. Yet these discoveries also reveal human resilience. Raised platforms, Early drainage systems and rudimentary levees suggest that ancient people were not passive victims. They studied the rhythms of rivers, the swelling of seas, and the warning signs of storms. In their myths, this knowledge was encoded as divine guidance, prophetic visions, or mystical instructions. Utnapishtim's precise arc dimensions, Noah's careful provisioning, and Manu's obedience to the fish's warning could all be reflections of real techniques to survive floods, passed down through story and memory. Myths may have been humanity's first form of engineering manual, disguised in narrative, morality, and ritual. There's also a psychological aspect to consider. Humans are storytellers by nature, and in times of catastrophe, the need to explain, remember, and warn becomes paramount. By transforming floods into moral, divine, or mystical narratives, ancient people ensured that the lessons of survival would endure. Stories of waters rising, families escaping, and life continuing provide not just entertainment. They preserve knowledge, warn future generations, and offer a sense of control over forces that are otherwise uncontrollable. The earth provides the evidence, and the human mind encodes it into story, bridging the gap between reality and imagination. Some floods left marks so dramatic that they could be traced across continents. Evidence of sudden glacial melts, river breaches, and tsunamis indicate that entire regions could have been submerged rapidly. In the Mediterranean, traces of ancient tsunamis align with myths of drowning civilizations and angry gods. In South Asia, sediments reveal sudden rises in river levels, wiping out settlements and prompting migrations that would reshape societies. These events, though separated by distance and culture, all bear a haunting similarity. The world suddenly transformed by water, leaving only a few survivors and countless stories. The physical evidence also raises questions that myths alone cannot answer. How frequent were these floods? Were they localized catastrophes or global events capable of inspiring remarkably similar stories across cultures? Could some floods have been so immense that they reshaped coastlines, created new rivers, and forced migrations that changed the trajectory of human history? Each archaeological discovery provides a clue, yet every answer leads to deeper questions, revealing a hidden complexity behind what was once dismissed as mere legend. In exploring this evidence, it becomes clear that the myths and the earth are telling the same story, but in different languages. One speaks through narrative, morality, and divine symbolism. The other speaks through sediment, ruins, and fossilized remains. Together, they create a multi-layered memory of humanity's encounter with overwhelming waters, a record that is at once terrifying, awe-inspiring, and profoundly human. By connecting the myths with the archaeological record, we begin to see the flood not as a simple story or an isolated event, but as a recurring thread woven through human history. The rising waters, the vanishing cities, and the desperate struggle for survival all point to a truth that transcends culture, language, and time. And yet, even with all this evidence, questions remain. What triggered the greatest floods? Were they the product of natural climate shifts, tectonic upheavals, or something else entirely? And perhaps most hauntingly, what other secrets lie hidden beneath the earth, waiting for humans to uncover them, waiting to connect the stories of old with the realities of the past? The flood, it seems, is a puzzle written both in myth and in stone, waiting for the bold, the curious, and the patient to piece it together. And as we move from the evidence preserved in the earth to the stories preserved in human memory, we begin to glimpse a mystery that is far larger than any single civilization, a mystery that spans continents, millennia, and the very nature of human survival itself. Amid the echoes of floods in distant lands and buried cities, one story looms larger than most: the biblical flood, the tale of Noah and the Arkansas. Unlike the fragmented whispers of ancient Mesopotamian legends or the poetic verses of Vedic texts, this narrative became a cornerstone of faith, morality, and human identity. It is a story that continues to captivate imagination, a story that shapes how millions of people understand humanity's relationship with the divine, with nature, and with itself. And yet, at its heart, it is also a story of terror, survival, and the fragile thread upon which life hangs. The story begins with a world steeped in corruption and violence. Humanity, in its pride and greed, has strayed from the path of righteousness. Civilization, with all its achievements and complexity, has become a breeding ground for sin. According to the text, God looks upon the earth and regrets the creation of humankind, deciding to cleanse the world with a flood so vast, so complete, that only a single family will endure. It is a chilling beginning, one that casts the reader into a world poised on the brink of annihilation. The moral stakes are immense. The flood is not merely a natural disaster, but a divine judgment, a reckoning that will erase the sins of the past and set the stage for renewal. Noah emerges as the reluctant hero, a figure of faith and obedience. Unlike his contemporaries, he is described as righteous and blameless, a man chosen for reasons that seem both simple and profound. He is given precise instructions: build an ark of gopher wood, seal it with pitch, gather pairs of every living creature, and store provisions for the coming storm. The narrative emphasizes preparation, foresight, and trust in divine guidance. Each measurement, each detail of the ark, carries symbolic weight, reinforcing the idea that survival depends on both human action and alignment with higher wisdom. As the waters rise, the story plunges into drama. Torrential rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. Rivers burst their banks, and mountains are submerged beneath a relentless tide. The ark floats atop a world transformed, a solitary vessel carrying life amid chaos. The narrative captures the terror of isolation and the fragility of existence. Outside, familiar landscapes vanish. Inside, the confined space of the ark becomes a crucible of human endurance. Families cling to one another, animals stir and cry, and every sound, every splash, every roar of water reminds the inhabitants that they are at the mercy of forces beyond comprehension. Yet, amid despair, hope persists. The ark is not just a means of survival. It is a vessel of renewal. When the flood finally subsides, Noah sends out a raven, then a dove, testing the earth for signs of life. The tension is palpable. The possibility of a world utterly destroyed looms large. And yet, the first glimpse of land and greenery brings relief, awe, and the promise of a second chance. The narrative is as much about patience and observation as it is about courage, emphasizing the delicate balance between human effort and the rhythms of nature. What makes the biblical flood particularly compelling and mysterious is the emotional and ethical depth embedded within the story. It is a tale of judgment and mercy, of destruction and rebirth. It forces readers to confront fundamental questions. What is humanity's responsibility to one another and to the world? How does morality interact with survival? And what does it mean to be chosen, not just for personal safety, but as a guardian of life itself? The ark becomes both a literal and metaphorical vessel, a safe harbor amid judgment, a space where the past is erased and the future begins. Comparisons with other flood myths only heighten the intrigue. The structure of the biblical narrative mirrors the Sumerian and Babylonian accounts: divine warning, construction of a vessel, preservation of life, and a world reborn. Yet the biblical version emphasizes moral and spiritual dimensions in a way that many earlier myths only hint at. Whereas Utnapishtim's flood focuses on the gods' decision and human ingenuity, Noah's flood intertwines morality, divine justice, and covenant, leaving a lasting impression on culture, religion, and human imagination. Scholars and believers alike have debated endlessly whether this narrative represents literal history, metaphor, or a fusion of both. But the story's power, its ability to resonate emotionally and spiritually, is undeniable. The flood also conveys a sense of universal vulnerability. No matter wealth, status, or power, humanity is equally subject to forces beyond its control. Mountains are submerged, cities vanish, and even the most fortified dwellings are powerless before the deluge. Yet, Paradoxically, it is this very vulnerability that allows the story to inspire hope. Survival is possible, but it requires obedience, preparation, and courage. The Ark is both refuge and test, a space where character, faith, and action determine the fate of humanity. Even today, the story continues to captivate and mystify. Religious communities interpret it as divine instruction. Historians see echoes of ancient Mesopotamian floods. Scientists speculate about real-world events that could have inspired such a narrative. The interplay of history, archaeology, and theology adds layers of intrigue, blurring the line between myth and reality. Could massive post-Ice Age floods, rising seas, or sudden river surges have inspired the biblical account? And if so, how much of the narrative is faithful memory, and how much is moral storytelling? The questions remain as compelling as the story itself. As the narrative concludes with Noah stepping on a dry land, releasing the animals, and witnessing the first rays of sunlight on a world cleansed, the audience feels both relief and awe. The flood was a test, a trial by water that left its mark on history, culture, and collective memory. The covenant that follows, symbolized by the rainbow, offers reassurance but also a reminder. Life is fragile, and human responsibility is eternal. The biblical flood, in all its drama, terror, and hope, becomes a lens through which we can examine human nature, morality, and our relationship with forces far greater than ourselves. The story leaves us with a lingering question, one that resonates beyond theology or archaeology. Was this narrative merely a moral lesson, or was it inspired by actual events, glimpses of a global catastrophe remembered across generations? The answer remains elusive, but the power of the story, its ability to grip, terrify, and inspire, is undeniable. As we move from the biblical flood to other ancient accounts, the pattern begins to take shape. Humanity, confronted by water's overwhelming force, responds with ingenuity, faith, and memory, ensuring that the lessons of survival endure across millennia. Long before the story of Noah was recorded, the people of Sumer told a tale of a great king, a hero who faced a flood unlike any other. The Epic of Gilgamesh recounts the story of Utnapishtim, a man chosen by the gods to survive the waters that would wipe out humanity. Unlike the biblical flood, this narrative is steeped in adventure, divine intrigue, and the relentless pursuit of immortality. Yet the parallels are undeniable. Rising waters, a vessel to preserve life, and the survival of the worthy all echo across millennia, hinting at a shared memory or experience that predates recorded history. Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, learns of Utnapishtim's secret while searching for the key to eternal life. Through his journey, the story reveals layers of human emotion, curiosity, grief, fear, and awe. Utnapishtim recounts how the gods decided to destroy humankind with a flood, not entirely unlike the biblical narrative. He was instructed to build a massive boat, gathering his family, friends, and the seeds of life itself. Every detail is described meticulously. The dimensions, the materials, the sealing of the vessel, all designed to withstand the fury of the waters. It is a blueprint of survival embedded in myth, preserved across generations, and hauntingly familiar to modern audiences. The flood itself is portrayed as cataclysmic. Storm clouds gather, the sky darkens, and rain pours without pause. The river swells, devouring homes, fields, and entire cities. Utnapishtim's ark rises above the chaos, a fragile sanctuary amid the relentless forces of nature. The narrative emphasizes both the terror of annihilation and the meticulous preparation required to survive. It is a story that resonates with universal human fears, the loss of home, the threat to family, and the fragility of life in the face of overwhelming natural forces. One of the most compelling aspects of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the role of the divine. The flood is not simply a natural disaster. It is a tool wielded by gods with their own agendas, caprices, and disagreements. Some gods express regret, some show compassion, and some revel in destruction. This divine complexity mirrors human experiences of morality, justice, and fate. Utnapishtim survival is not a reward for virtue alone. It is also the result of obedience, ingenuity, and a recognition of forces beyond mortal understanding. In this sense, the story carries both practical and ethical lessons, blending survival with spirituality. The ark, in this epic, becomes a character in its own right. Constructed with care, it shelters life as the world outside is submerged. Animals are preserved, family members are kept safe, and the continuity of civilization is ensured. Here, the vessel is not only a refuge, but also a symbol, a testament to human foresight, a bridge between destruction and renewal, and a reminder that knowledge, preparation, and respect for forces greater than oneself are essential to survival. The imagery of life floating above the drowned earth is both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a motif that resonates across cultures and eras. What is particularly striking is the uncanny similarity to the biblical narrative. Both Utnapishtim and Noah receive divine warning: construct a vessel, save life, and witness the floodwater subside. Both stories conclude with a covenant or reward. Utnapishtim is granted immortality. Noah enters into a covenant with God marked by the rainbow. These parallels have fueled centuries of scholarly debate. Were these stories influenced by one another? Did they emerge independently from shared human memory of catastrophic floods? Or do they reflect an archetypal pattern ingrained in the human psyche, a narrative that surfaces whenever humans confront forces beyond comprehension? Beyond the technical and moral aspects, the Epic of Gilgamesh delves deeply into the emotional resonance of catastrophe. Utnapishtim describes watching the world vanish, the cries of the drowned, and the helplessness of witnessing destruction on a massive scale. There is grief, regret, and a profound sense of loss, yet also awe at the raw power of nature and the caprice of the divine. Through these stories, ancient people processed trauma, encoded survival knowledge, and contemplated the limits of human power. The flood becomes not only a test of life, but a meditation on mortality, resilience, and the continuity of civilization. The epic also introduces a subtle, almost haunting twist. Survival is not permanent, and even the chosen cannot escape the limitations of human life. Utnapishtim survives, but his immortality sets him apart, emphasizing that while preparation, courage, and obedience can preserve life, they do not grant freedom from consequence or the inevitability of change. It is a reminder that survival carries its own costs, a theme that resonates across all flood myths. The waters reshape not only the physical world, but the moral, spiritual, and emotional landscape of those who endure. By exploring the Epic of Gilgamesh, we begin to see how flood myths weave together the threads of human experience, divine interaction, and natural catastrophe. They are not mere stories. They are records of awe, fear, ingenuity, and moral reflection. They preserve memory in ways that stone, clay, and sediment alone cannot. And when viewed alongside other myths, the biblical flood, Manu's story, or Native American legends, the parallels create a startling impression. Disparate civilizations, separated by geography and culture, preserving remarkably similar narratives of destruction and survival. The tale of Utnapishtim leaves a lingering question, one that haunts every flood narrative. If the gods or nature test humanity through overwhelming catastrophe, what does it truly mean to endure? Is survival merely a matter of preparation and obedience? Or is there a deeper lesson, hidden in the waters themselves, about resilience, morality, and the human spirit? As we continue to explore flood myths around the world, we will encounter this question again and again, each time cloaked in local culture, divine interpretation, and human emotion, yet always pointing toward the same mysterious truth. Floods are more than water. They are mirrors of humanity itself. Far to the east, long before the modern nations of India existed, a different flood story unfolded, one that is as mystical as it is instructive. In the Vedic texts, the tale of Manu, the first human, carries the echoes of a deluge remarkably similar to those of Mesopotamia and the Hebrew Bible. Manu, a figure of piety and foresight, was warned by a divine fish of an impending flood that would sweep the world clean, erasing life and civilization alike. Unlike the Sumerian or biblical narratives, Manu's story intertwines human responsibility, divine guidance, and the cyclical nature of time itself, reflecting the philosophical depth of the culture that preserved it. Manu's warning came not in dreams or direct command, but through a small, seemingly ordinary fish that sought protection in his hands. The fish spoke with a voice of authority, revealing that the end of the world was near and that survival required careful preparation. Manu, acting with faith and humility, heeded the warning. He constructed a boat, taking with him the seeds of life, both plant and animal, and ensured the continuation of knowledge and civilization. The story emphasizes moral responsibility. Survival is not just about self-preservation, but about preserving life itself and maintaining the delicate balance of the world. The flood described in Manu's story is as cataclysmic as any in the world's myths. The heavens open, rains pour without end, and waters rise to cover mountains and valleys. Humanity faces annihilation, yet the chosen are guided by wisdom, courage, and divine intervention. Manu's vessel, tethered to the fish, drifts through the chaos, becoming a sanctuary amid universal destruction. There is an almost cinematic tension in this moment. The contrast between fragile human life and the vast, indifferent power of water, the struggle to maintain order in the face of utter chaos. The narrative also highlights the theme of cosmic cycles. In Vedic philosophy, the universe moves through ages of creation, preservation, and destruction. The flood is not simply punishment. It is a natural reset, part of the eternal rhythm of time. Manu's survival ensures that life, morality, and knowledge endure through these cycles, preserving the continuity of existence. This philosophical framing adds a layer of complexity absent in many other flood myths. The disaster is not arbitrary, nor purely punitive, but part of a universal order in which humans must play their role responsibly. Animals and plants, carefully gathered by Manu, symbolize the preservation of life in all its forms. Unlike some narratives where divine favor alone grants survival, Manu's story emphasizes action, foresight, and preparation. The ark or boat becomes a microcosm of the world itself, a floating seedbed for renewal. Here, mythology and practical wisdom merge. Ancient humans encode survival strategies and ecological understanding within narrative, ensuring that knowledge of life's fragility and resilience passes through generations. The divine fish itself is a symbol rich with meaning. It represents guidance, wisdom, and protection, bridging the human and the cosmic. The motif of a mystical guide, whether a fish, angel, or messenger, recurs in flood myths worldwide. It emphasizes that survival is rarely achieved alone. It requires attentiveness, humility, and a willingness to act upon guidance. Manu's interaction with the fish is a subtle reminder that the forces shaping human destiny are often inscrutable, and that recognizing and respecting them is as vital as practical preparation. What is particularly fascinating is how the narrative resonates with natural phenomena. India, with its monsoon rivers, glacial floods, and ancient oceanic shifts, would have witnessed sudden, devastating inundations. Manu's flood, preserved in sacred texts, could reflect the collective memory of these events. The story encodes not just spiritual lessons, but also environmental awareness. The warning, the preparation, and the preservation of life all mirror practical responses to catastrophic floods. The myth becomes a bridge between memory and experience, between human observation and divine narrative. The emotional and moral depth of Manu's story cannot be understated. It explores fear, awe, and hope, portraying a humanity confronted by forces beyond its control. Manu's courage and obedience offer a model of ethical action. Survival is intertwined with responsibility, not just for oneself, but for all living beings. The flood is simultaneously a trial, a cleansing, and a chance for renewal, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability and resilience. Like the other flood myths, Manu's narrative ends with a moment of hope and renewal. As the waters recede, the world is reshaped, life is preserved, and a future of civilization continues. The story emphasizes continuity rather than mere survival. Humanity is tasked not only with living, but with rebuilding, learning from catastrophe, and respecting the balance of creation. The flood becomes both a warning and a promise, a dramatic demonstration of the delicate interplay between destruction and preservation. When placed alongside other myths, from Utnapishtim in Mesopotamia to Noah in the Bible, the story of Manu reveals the astonishing universality of flood narratives. Independent cultures, separated by geography and time, developed remarkably similar stories of warning, survival, and renewal. Whether these narratives were inspired by real events, shared memories, or archetypal patterns in the human psyche, their convergence is undeniable. Humanity, confronted with the destructive power of water, consistently responds with ingenuity, morality, and hope. The story of Manu leaves us with profound questions. How much of human history is encoded in myth? How did ancient societies understand, survive, and transmit knowledge of natural disasters? And, most hauntingly, what does the recurrence of these flood myths tell us about the relationship between humans, nature, and the forces we cannot control? The answers may be elusive, but the myths themselves offer a bridge, connecting the human imagination to memory, observation, and the universal struggle to endure. As we continue our journey through the world's flood narratives, Manu's story reminds us that these myths are more than entertainment. They are vessels of human experience, preserving lessons of survival, morality, and resilience across centuries. And just as the waters rise and recede in these ancient tales, so too does the mystery of the floods rise in our minds, compelling us to explore, question, and wonder. While the stories of the East and the Middle East dominated early human civilization, the Americas, long separated by vast oceans, also preserved tales of catastrophic floods, passed down through generations. Among Native American tribes, floods are not just events. They're moral tests, spiritual journeys, and lessons in survival. From the Hopi and Navajo in the deserts of North America to the Inca and Moche in the highlands and coastal regions of South America, the waters rise again and again in story, transforming life and reshaping the moral fabric of humanity. These myths, though culturally unique, carry the same echoes of destruction, survival, and renewal found across the Old World. Among the Hopi, one of the most striking flood narratives involves the world being cleansed by water for the misdeeds of humanity. The survivors, warned by spiritual guides, construct a raft or climb to high ground, preserving life in miniature until the waters subside. Animals, family, and sacred knowledge are carefully preserved, emphasizing that survival is not just physical, it is spiritual, moral, and cultural. The flood is an agent of renewal, a test of adherence to cosmic law, and a reminder of the delicate balance between human action and natural forces. Similarly, in South America, the Moche civilization recounted floods of unimaginable scale, often tied to the wrath of gods or disruptions in the natural order. Rivers would overrun their banks, washing away settlements and forcing migrations into higher lands. These stories served multiple purposes. They were warnings, historical memory, and moral guidance. Elders taught that floods were caused by imbalance, by disrespect for the earth or failure to honor the gods, and that proper behavior, reverence, and preparation could mitigate catastrophe. The waters were both punishment and lesson, reshaping not only the land, but human conduct itself. The consistency of these narratives is remarkable, especially considering the geographic isolation of the Americas from Mesopotamia, India, and the Mediterranean. Across cultures and continents, humans independently developed remarkably similar stories, divine or spiritual warning, preparation, preservation of life, and the eventual rebirth of the world. Whether it is a raft, a canoe, or simply climbing to a mountaintop, the structures of survival and the moral lessons embedded in the tales remain strikingly consistent. It suggests that human beings, when faced with catastrophic water events, respond in universal ways, encoding those experiences into story, ritual, and cultural memory. The floods of the Americas also reveal fascinating symbolic patterns. Water, often portrayed as both destructive and purifying, becomes a force that tests character. Those who survive are not merely lucky. They are attentive, moral, and prepared. Animals frequently play a critical role, symbolizing the continuity of life and the interdependence between humans and the natural world. The stories emphasize a harmony that must be maintained. The flood destroys when balance is disrupted and preserves when respect and wisdom guide action. These are lessons as practical as they are spiritual, transmitted through generations to ensure both survival and ethical conduct. Archaeological evidence in the Americas, though less extensive than in the Middle East, supports the possibility of ancient floods. Riverine societies show signs of sudden inundations, buried settlements, waterlogged artifacts, and sediment layers consistent with catastrophic water events. In the Andes, for example, layers of silt in former riverbeds indicate sudden and dramatic floods that would have forced communities to relocate. Coastal civilizations along the Pacific, too, bear traces of ancient tsunamis and rising waters. While no single flood aligns perfectly with the myths, the recurrence of floods in both story and sediment suggests that oral traditions preserved real events, encoded in a narrative for survival, warning, and teaching. There is also an intriguing psychological component. In societies where written records did not exist, storytelling served as memory itself. Elders were custodians of events long past, embedding lessons of survival, morality, and respect for nature within narrative frameworks that could be easily remembered and passed down. The flood myths of the Americas, like those of Mesopotamia, India, and the Bible, demonstrate humanity's instinct to encode collective experience into story, a form of cultural DNA that transmits knowledge across generations. The ark, the raft, or the mountaintop becomes a vessel not just for life, but for memory, culture, and moral understanding. The emotional resonance of these stories is profound. Imagine the terror of rising waters, the uncertainty of survival, the tension between human vulnerability and instinctive courage. The narratives convey fear, hope, and moral contemplation, ensuring that listeners are not merely entertained. They are educated, warned, and emotionally prepared for the unpredictable forces of nature. The flood, in these myths, is a crucible of character, a trial by water that tests not only physical endurance, but ethical responsibility. These Native American floods, when viewed alongside other global myths, underscore a remarkable truth. The flood motif is not the product of cultural exchange alone. Across oceans and continents, isolated societies arrived at the same narrative structure independently. Warning, preparation, preservation, and renewal appear repeatedly, suggesting that floods, whether experienced, remembered, or imagined, tap into a universal aspect of the human condition. In facing overwhelming natural forces, humans instinctively create stories that encode survival knowledge, moral guidance, and cultural identity. As we consider the Americas floods alongside those of the Old World, a pattern emerges. Water is both destroyer and teacher. The flood erases, tests, and purifies. The vessel, whether ark, raft, or canoe, is both a literal means of survival and a symbolic preservation of life, knowledge, and morality. Across cultures, floods force humans to confront mortality, act decisively, and recognize the limits of control over nature. In this universality, we begin to see the flood not as isolated myth, but as a global narrative thread, weaving together the human experience across time, space, and culture. By the end of these narratives, the audience senses both the terror and the transcendence of floods. They are natural events and moral trials, physical destruction and spiritual renewal. From the Americas to Mesopotamia, from India to the Bible, humans confront water's overwhelming power and emerge with lessons, memories, and stories that endure. The flood is more than an event. It is a universal mirror of human resilience, morality, and the instinct to survive. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, scattered islands hold secrets of ancient floods, tales carried by wind, waves, and memory. The cultures of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia developed myths of rising seas and devastating storms, preserving narratives of survival that resonate with stories from continents far away. These islands, isolated yet intimately tied to the ocean, understood both its generosity and its fury. Here, the flood is not an abstract event. It is immediate, visceral, and unavoidable, a force that shapes the land, the people, and the very rhythm of daily life. In Polynesian lore, flood stories often begin with divine or spiritual warning. A deity, ancestral spirit, or mystical creature alerts the people to an impending deluge, often triggered by human imbalance or hubris. The warnings are sometimes subtle: a change in the tides, an unusual storm, a prophetic dream. But those who heed them are given the tools to survive. Boats, canoes, or rafts are prepared, food and seeds are collected, and animals are guided to safety. The narrative emphasizes attentiveness, moral behavior, and action, reinforcing a crucial principle. Survival depends not only on physical preparation, but on understanding and respecting the forces that govern the world. One compelling motif in Pacific flood myths is the entwining of human and animal survival. Just as Noah preserved pairs of every creature, and Manu gathered the seeds of life, Polynesian myths describe sacred animals, birds, or fish accompanying humans on floating vessels. These creatures are often not just survivors, but symbols, carrying the essence of the natural world into the renewed post-flood environment. In this sense, the ark or raft is both practical and symbolic, a floating sanctuary preserving the interdependence of humans, animals, and nature. The flood becomes a crucible of balance, teaching that life's continuity relies on respect, cooperation, and foresight. The scale of these Pacific floods is staggering in imagination. Some tales describe waves reaching mountains, entire islands disappearing, and storms that rage without pause. Yet, amidst this chaos, survival is possible, not by chance but through diligence, obedience to divine instruction, and moral rectitude. Families cling together in tightly woven canoes, ancestors guide the living, and every splash, every gust of wind, carries lessons about vulnerability and resilience. The flood is at once terrifying and transformative, a dramatic backdrop against which human courage and ingenuity are tested. Interestingly, these narratives often include a cyclical perspective similar to India's Manu story. Floods are not merely punishment. They're natural resets, part of a rhythm that ensures the world is cleansed, renewed, and preserved. Life is endangered, but the post-flood world is imbued with potential. Islands, vegetation, and human communities are reborn, reminding listeners that catastrophe carries within it the seeds of renewal. This cyclical lens offers a profound understanding of human vulnerability. Survival is temporary, life is fragile, but renewal is always possible. Archaeological and geological studies in the Pacific support the plausibility of these myths. Evidence of rising sea levels, submerged structures, and massive storm events hints at real disasters that ancient peoples may have witnessed. Coral reefs, which preserve the marks of historical sea surges, along with sediment layers in coastal areas, indicate that the ocean has periodically reshaped islands and coastlines. Such findings suggest that oral traditions may preserve echoes of actual events, encoded in a narrative with moral and practical lessons for future generations. In this way, myth and geology intertwine, blurring the line between imagination and memory. The emotional resonance of these Pacific flood myths is as striking as anywhere else in the world. The tension between destruction and preservation, fear and hope, is palpable. Audiences are drawn into the chaos of rising waters, the struggle to preserve life, and the painstaking attention required to survive. Every storm, every wave, every flash of lightning carries moral and practical instruction. The flood is a teacher, a mirror reflecting the human struggle against forces greater than ourselves and the necessity of courage, foresight, and obedience. A subtle yet powerful theme in these myths is the connection between survival and morality. Those who ignore warning signs, act with hubris, or disrupt the natural balance are swept away, while those who listen, act wisely, and respect ancestral and divine guidance endure. The floods are not random acts of destruction. They are tests, moral crucibles, and reminders that human life is intimately connected to the broader cosmos. This lesson is universal, appearing in nearly every flood narrative around the globe. The Pacific flood stories also highlight human adaptability. Unlike the continental myths, where vast rivers and seas dominate the narrative, island cultures had to navigate small, fragile land masses, often with limited resources. Survival required ingenuity, seaworthy vessels, knowledge of currents, and cooperation between communities. These practical details, embedded within myth, reveal an astonishing capacity for human problem-solving in the face of overwhelming natural threats. The narrative becomes a combination of practical guide, spiritual instruction, and cultural memory. When placed alongside the other global flood myths, from Mesopotamia's Utnapishtim to Noah, Manu, and the Americas' diverse traditions, the Pacific narratives reinforce a remarkable pattern. Humans, no matter where they lived, responded to catastrophic floods with stories that emphasized warning, preparation, preservation, morality, and renewal. These stories encode knowledge of nature, human behavior, and cosmic order, transcending geography and time. They suggest a universal human response to water's overwhelming power, to observe, learn, act, and remember. By the end of these Pacific tales, the flood emerges not merely as an event, but as a profound metaphor. It is destruction and creation, fear and hope, chaos and order. The human journey through the deluge is a mirror of resilience, foresight, and morality, teaching lessons that remain relevant across centuries. The islands, the waves, the floating vessels, and the preserved life form a tapestry of survival wisdom that is both practical and spiritual, connecting humanity to the rhythms of the natural world and to each other. Across the African continent, ancient civilizations preserve their own tales of catastrophic floods, blending divine power, human morality, and natural disaster into rich and compelling narratives. In Egypt, the story of the Nile, its life-giving waters and its potential for devastation, was central to the culture, religion, and understanding of the world. The annual inundation brought fertility to the land, but legends speak of floods of extraordinary magnitude, ones that could erase settlements, reshape the landscape, and test the resilience of humanity. These narratives, though unique in setting and symbolism, echo the universal themes found in flood myths worldwide. The Egyptian myths often begin with a disruption of balance, a recurring motif in global flood stories. Humanity's hubris, negligence, or failure to honor the gods could trigger cataclysmic water events. One tale describes the god Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, who could unleash the river's full fury when the natural and moral orders were ignored. As waters rose, homes and fields vanished, and the chaos forced people to cling to higher ground, preserving not only life but wisdom, culture, and tradition. Here, the flood is not merely a natural event. It is a moral and spiritual test, a reflection of humanity's responsibility to maintain harmony with the divine and the natural world. One of the most striking aspects of Egyptian flood myths is the interplay between order and chaos. The Nile, a source of sustenance, also represents a volatile force capable of destruction. The duality of the river mirrors the broader concept of ma'at, balance, truth, and cosmic order, which is central to Egyptian thought. Surviving a flood required more than practical skill. It demanded respect for cosmic law, ethical behavior, and attentiveness to the cycles of nature. The flood, then, becomes a crucible of morality, blending survival with spiritual understanding, a lesson echoed across continents in similar narratives. In some stories, divine guidance mirrors that of Noah, Utnapishtim, and Manu. The gods would warn chosen individuals, instructing them to preserve seeds, animals, or knowledge, ensuring the continuation of life and culture. Boats or rafts, carefully prepared, provided refuge from the deluge. These vessels were not mere survival tools. They symbolized humanity's connection to the divine, the continuity of civilization, and the preservation of moral and cultural order. Just as in other myths, survival required obedience, wisdom, and courage, a universal human theme encoded in narrative. Archaeological evidence supports the possibility of dramatic flood events in ancient Egypt. Geological studies suggest that periods of unusually high Nile floods could have submerged large areas of farmland and settlements, forcing mass migrations and reshaping societies. Sudden inundations, sediment deposits, and altered river channels hint at real events that may have inspired myths and rituals. Oral traditions likely preserved memories of these floods, embedding them into moral and spiritual frameworks. In this way, myth and geology intersect, with stories preserving practical knowledge about survival and ethical behavior across generations. Emotionally, the Egyptian floods capture the tension between fear and reverence. The rising waters represent both threat and sustenance, terror and renewal. Families cling to one another as fields disappear beneath the currents, while priests and rulers interpret signs from the gods to guide survival. The flood becomes a stage upon which courage, ingenuity, and moral integrity are tested. Unlike some other myths where water is purely destructive, Egyptian floods are nuanced. They nurture, they challenge, and they demand respect. This duality adds layers of depth, making the narrative simultaneously practical, ethical, and spiritual. The stories also emphasize community and collective action. Survival is rarely individual. It requires cooperation, shared knowledge, and collective adherence to moral and spiritual laws. Villages, families, and religious authorities must act in concert to withstand the waters and preserve life. The flood is both a test of individual virtue and a measure of societal cohesion. This theme resonates globally, appearing in myths from Mesopotamia to the Pacific, reinforcing the idea that human survival in the face of overwhelming natural forces is inseparable from moral and social responsibility. Interestingly, some Egyptian myths introduce the idea of cyclical floods, reminiscent of Manu's story in India and Pacific legends. Water rises and recedes in predictable patterns, reflecting the rhythm of nature and the universe. Humans must learn to live in harmony with these cycles, recognizing that catastrophe is not arbitrary, but part of a larger cosmic order. The moral of the story is clear. Preparation, reverence, and ethical conduct are essential for survival, not merely of the individual, but of civilization itself. The emotional and spiritual impact of these floods is profound. They teach fear, awe, humility, and hope, illustrating the delicate balance between destruction and renewal. The rising waters become a mirror reflecting human vulnerability, ingenuity, and morality. The lessons encoded in these myths about observation, preparedness, and ethical responsibility are strikingly consistent with flood stories from every corner of the globe. Humans, confronted by overwhelming forces, have always turned to narrative to encode survival knowledge, moral guidance, and spiritual insight. By comparing Egyptian flood myths to those of Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, and the Pacific, a striking pattern emerges. Across cultures, continents, and epochs, Floods are more than natural disasters. They are moral and spiritual trials, vehicles for teaching survival, cooperation, and ethical behavior. Boats, rafts, and elevated refuges are not just practical. They symbolize humanity's resilience, foresight, and respect for cosmic order. The waters test, destroy, and renew, creating a universal narrative that binds human experience across time and space. The Egyptian floods, with their interplay of terror, reverence, and renewal, remind us that water is both destroyer and teacher. The narratives encode the lessons of survival, the necessity of morality, and the importance of community. They bridge human experience with natural observation and spiritual insight. And when viewed alongside the world's other flood myths, they contribute to a global mosaic, a shared human story of fear, courage, ingenuity, and hope, rising from the waters to endure across millennia. In the vast landscapes of East Asia, ancient China preserved its own tales of devastating floods, stories that shaped culture, governance, and philosophy for millennia. Unlike some myths where a single individual survives a catastrophe, Chinese flood narratives often involve heroic rulers, ingenious solutions, and the unification of communities to restore order. Among these, the story of Yu the Great stands as the quintessential flood hero, a figure whose legacy blends ingenuity, determination, and moral authority. His story resonates with universal themes, connecting human courage to natural forces, while offering a uniquely Chinese vision of resilience and governance. The narrative begins with a world ravaged by floods, rivers overflowing, villages submerged, and farmland destroyed. Humanity struggles not only to survive, but to restore order and sustain life. In contrast to simple divine warning, the Chinese floods are often framed as challenges to be studied and mastered. The waters are not arbitrary punishments. They are forces of nature that test human wisdom, ingenuity, and perseverance. Leaders and communities must cooperate, understand the environment, and implement strategies to survive and thrive. In this sense, the flood becomes both a natural and moral challenge, teaching lessons about responsibility, resilience, and the balance between human action and environmental forces. Yu the Great emerges as a symbol of ingenuity and leadership. According to legend, he spent years controlling the floodwaters by dredging rivers, building canals, and redirecting water to safe paths. Unlike stories where salvation comes through divine intervention or a single arc, Yu's achievement relies on sustained human effort, planning, and cooperation. His story emphasizes that survival is not passive. It demands observation, experimentation, and ethical dedication to the welfare of the community. The flood, therefore, is not merely a test of morality, but a test of intellect, leadership, and collective endurance. The scale of the floods in these narratives is awe-inspiring. Entire regions are submerged, populations displaced, and ecosystems altered. Yet, amid this chaos, human action becomes a force for renewal. Yu's efforts demonstrate that knowledge, courage, and coordinated effort can tame even overwhelming natural events. The narrative conveys both fear and hope. Fear of water's destructive power, and hope that human ingenuity, persistence, and ethical leadership can restore balance. This duality mirrors flood myths across the globe, destruction intertwined with renewal, terror with inspiration. The moral dimension of the Chinese floods is particularly significant. The disaster is a reflection of societal and environmental imbalance. Communities that fail to maintain harmony with the land, ignore warnings, or act selfishly contribute to catastrophe. Conversely, those who observe natural signs, work cooperatively, and act ethically are more likely to survive and rebuild. The flood becomes a moral and social mirror, demonstrating that human action, guided by wisdom and communal responsibility, is integral to survival. This perspective differs subtly from divine-centric myths, emphasizing human agency alongside respect for natural forces. Emotionally, the story of Yu the Great captures the tension between desperation and perseverance. For 13 years, he labored tirelessly, navigating rivers, coordinating communities, and transforming the landscape. Families clung to elevated ground, towns adapted to rising waters, and every successful diversion of the river was a triumph of courage and ingenuity. The narrative illustrates the psychological and ethical stakes of survival. Fear, fatigue, determination, and moral responsibility converge, making the flood a crucible for both human character and community cohesion. The symbolism of the rivers and the engineered channels is profound. Water, both destructive and life-giving, mirrors human challenges, unpredictable, powerful, and demanding careful attention. The canals you built are more than practical measures. They are monuments to human resilience and intelligence, representing a harmonious balance between civilization and nature. Unlike the single-arc narratives of other cultures, the Chinese flood emphasizes sustained, organized action, collaboration, and the importance of infrastructure and planning. It is a story of humans learning to coexist with, rather than merely survive, nature's immense power. The legacy of Yu the Great extends beyond flood control. His story became a foundation for governance, ethics, and culture in China. Leadership, moral integrity, and technical skill were celebrated alongside courage and foresight. The flood narrative thus becomes both a practical guide and a moral parable, illustrating that human ingenuity, coupled with ethical responsibility, can confront and overcome even the most overwhelming natural disasters. It is a uniquely humanistic take on survival, emphasizing that cooperation, intelligence, and virtue are essential to endure catastrophe. Archaeological and geological studies support the plausibility of historical floods in China, particularly along the Yellow River, often called China's Sorrow, due to its periodic devastation. Massive floods, sediment deposits, and ancient river channels indicate that communities had to contend with unpredictable and catastrophic water events. Oral traditions and early historical records likely preserve these experiences, transforming them into narratives that combine practical lessons, moral guidance, and heroic exemplars. The myths encode collective memory in ways that remain relevant across generations, blending history and morality into enduring stories. Placed alongside global flood myths, from Noah's Ark and Utnapishtim to Manu, the Americas, the Pacific, and Egypt, the Chinese narratives illustrate a remarkable universality. The central themes persist: overwhelming water, survival, morality, ingenuity, and renewal. Yet each culture adds its unique perspective. In China, the emphasis on collective effort, engineering, and ethical leadership offers a distinct lens on human response to catastrophe, complementing other myths that highlight divine intervention, individual heroism, or spiritual guidance. Together, these stories form a rich tapestry of human experience with water's power, linking morality, survival, and ingenuity across time and space. By the end of the Chinese flood myths, we see water not only as a destructive force, but also as a teacher and catalyst for human innovation. The narrative underscores the necessity of observation, planning, moral action, and collective effort. Floods are both trials and opportunities, demanding courage, intelligence, and ethical responsibility. They reshape not only the physical world, but human societies, governance, and values. In this, the Chinese stories resonate deeply with the global flood tradition, reminding us that water has always been a mirror of human resilience, morality, and ingenuity, a universal test and a universal teacher. Far to the east of China, in the islands of Japan, flood myths take on a uniquely spiritual and culturally rich dimension, blending natural catastrophe with Shinto beliefs and divine intervention. The Japanese archipelago, prone to typhoons, tsunamis, and torrential rains, inspired stories that reflected both the destructive power of water and its role as a purifying force. In these narratives, the flood is not simply an external event. It is intertwined with human morality, divine guidance, and the rhythms of the natural and spiritual world. One of the most prominent legends involves the goddess Izanami and her consort Izanagi, who, in some versions, influenced the creation and reshaping of the islands after great floods or chaotic waters. These stories emphasize the delicate balance between humanity and nature, illustrating that human behavior and respect for divine order are essential for survival. The flood is both destructive and transformative, washing away corruption, greed, or imbalance, and offering a clean slate upon which new life, communities, and moral order can emerge. In Japanese flood myths, divine messengers or spirits often serve as guides, warning humans of impending catastrophe. These supernatural alerts are subtle, dreams, signs in nature, or symbolic visions, requiring attentiveness and moral discernment. Unlike tales of a single heroic figure or a monumental arc, survival often depends on following guidance, working collectively, and harmonizing with natural and spiritual forces. This reflects a recurring theme across Japanese mythology. Humanity's vulnerability is inseparable from its need to act in accordance with moral, ethical, and ecological principles. The scale of the floods described in these myths is vast and awe-inspiring. Waters rise to engulf villages, sweep away forests, and submerge fertile valleys. The narrative tension is palpable. Families, communities, and even divine beings scramble to preserve life, knowledge, and moral order. Nature is both indifferent and purposeful. Its fury tests the resolve of humans, while its eventual reseeding signals opportunities for renewal. This interplay of fear and hope mirrors flood narratives across the world, linking Japan's myths to a universal understanding of catastrophe and survival. One fascinating motif in Japanese stories is the role of purification. Floodwaters are often seen as cleansing agents, removing impurities, corruption, or imbalance. In some tales, this act of cleansing is directly linked to moral behavior. The flood punishes hubris and negligence, while rewarding attentiveness, ethical conduct, and respect for divine order. Unlike many Western narratives that emphasize punishment or divine wrath, Japanese myths integrate disaster into a holistic vision of renewal and moral restoration, where water serves both as destroyer and teacher. The cultural and practical aspects of these myths are equally compelling. Japan's geographical vulnerability to flooding has been documented for millennia, and oral traditions may reflect memories of real catastrophic events. Typhoons, monsoon rains, and tsunamis would have shaped settlements, forced migrations, and influenced agricultural practices. The myths encode survival strategies: stay alert, follow natural signs, respect spiritual guidance, and work collectively to endure. Through storytelling, these practical lessons became moral and spiritual teachings, preserving essential knowledge across generations. Emotionally, the Japanese flood myths are intense and layered. They convey fear, awe, humility, and reverence for forces beyond human control. Families cling to one another, communities band together, and divine or ancestral guidance provides both warning and hope. The flood becomes a crucible for courage, resilience, and moral discernment, challenging humans to confront mortality, act wisely, and maintain ethical conduct. These emotional stakes resonate universally, connecting Japanese narratives with stories from Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, the Pacific, Egypt, and China. Another distinctive element is the symbolic interplay between water and islands. Japan's topography, mountainous, volcanic, and prone to seismic activity, turns the flood into a story of both destruction and creation. As waters rise and recede, new lands emerge, populations are forced to adapt, and human ingenuity is tested. Survival is both a moral and practical endeavor, requiring respect for natural rhythms, observation of the environment, and ethical action. The narrative encapsulates the human struggle to harmonize with an unpredictable and often overwhelming natural world. Like other flood myths, the Japanese stories convey the importance of preservation. Knowledge, culture, and life itself must be protected amid the rising waters. Families, sacred objects, and seeds of renewal are safeguarded, ensuring continuity despite destruction. The flood becomes a narrative device that links the past to the future, teaching that survival is inseparable from attentiveness, wisdom, and moral integrity. In this way, the stories function as both myth and instruction, embedding practical knowledge in spiritual and ethical frameworks. Viewed alongside global flood myths, Japanese narratives reveal striking commonalities and distinctive nuances. Like Utnapishtim, Noah, Manu, the Great and Pacific and African heroes, humans face overwhelming water, receive warning, take action, and preserve life. Yet Japan emphasizes harmony with natural and spiritual forces, purification, and cyclical renewal, highlighting cultural perspectives unique to the archipelago. The flood is simultaneously universal in theme and local in expression, illustrating humanity's shared struggle with water's power while celebrating cultural specificity. By the end of these tales, the Japanese flood myths leave a lingering sense of awe and reflection. The waters rise and fall, destruction gives way to renewal, and humanity's moral, practical, and spiritual responses are tested and celebrated. The narratives teach that survival is never passive. It requires observation, ethical action, cooperation, and respect for forces larger than oneself. The flood is a crucible, a teacher, and a mirror, revealing resilience, morality, and wisdom. Across centuries and continents, these lessons echo, reminding us that water, both feared and revered, shapes the human story as profoundly as any human hand. Returning to the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia offers some of the most detailed and ancient flood narratives known to humanity. Beyond the well-known story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, numerous Sumerian and Akkadian accounts hint at a deep cultural preoccupation with deluge, survival, and divine judgment. These myths, preserved on clay tablets thousands of years old, reflect both historical memory and profound existential questioning. Why does catastrophe strike? And what can humanity do to endure it? In the Mesopotamian stories, floods are often depicted as punishment from the gods. Humanity, through greed, disobedience, or hubris, disturbs the cosmic balance, and the divine council decides to cleanse the world with water. Yet, in a striking twist, select individuals are warned in advance. Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, or others, ensuring the continuation of life and knowledge. This duality, total destruction tempered by selective survival, creates intense narrative tension. Humanity is simultaneously fragile and resilient, subject to divine wrath, yet capable of obedience, foresight, and moral action. The flood itself is portrayed with epic scope. Waters rise to cover mountains, storms rage with relentless fury, and the earth is reshaped. The narrative captures the terror of helplessness. Homes vanish, families are separated, and the natural world seems indifferent to human suffering. Yet amidst this chaos, the chosen survivor demonstrates courage, ingenuity, and reverence for divine instruction. In Utnapishtim's tale, the construction of the massive boat, the careful preservation of animals, and the ability to endure the storm highlight human foresight and determination. Survival is not passive. It demands careful planning, patience, and moral fidelity. Emotionally, these myths are powerful. The flood is terrifying and awe-inspiring, a force beyond human comprehension. Families and communities are swept away, leaving the survivor alone with the weight of responsibility. The psychological stakes are immense. To live is to bear the duty of safeguarding life, knowledge, and culture. The tension between divine will and human action creates a narrative charged with drama, fear, and hope, mirroring the emotional resonance found in flood stories from across the globe. Interestingly, the Mesopotamian myths reveal a sophisticated understanding of natural processes. Some scholars suggest that these stories may encode memories of catastrophic flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which were prone to sudden inundations. Archaeological evidence indicates periods of extreme flooding that would have forced migrations, destroyed settlements, and altered agriculture. In this light, the myths are not merely imaginative. They are practical records of survival, moral instruction, and the ethical framework necessary to endure catastrophe. A recurring motif in these narratives is the preservation of life. Just as in Noah, Manu, or You the Great, the survivor is tasked with maintaining the continuity of species, culture, and knowledge. Animals are saved in pairs, seeds are stored, and human knowledge is safeguarded. The flood becomes not just a destructive event, but a test of stewardship and foresight. Survival is intertwined with responsibility. Humanity must ensure that life continues and that the moral and cultural lessons embedded in the narrative endure. The narrative structure of Mesopotamian floods is particularly notable for its detailed chronology. Storms rage for days, waters rise, and finally, the flood recedes, leaving a transformed landscape. This structured sequence reinforces the universality of human experience with water: observation, preparation, endurance, and eventual renewal. The parallels with other cultures are striking. Mesopotamian floods share motifs with India's Manu, the biblical Noah, African and Egyptian deluges, Pacific and Japanese legends. These recurring elements suggest that human societies, regardless of geography, grappled with water's power in remarkably similar ways. Mesopotamian flood myths also explore the tension between divine justice and human morality. Why are some chosen while others perish? Why do the gods act with such decisiveness? These questions elevate the narrative from mere survival tale to philosophical inquiry. Humanity's relationship with the divine, with morality, and with natural forces becomes a central theme. The flood is both punishment and opportunity, demonstrating that ethical action, foresight, and reverence for cosmic law are critical for survival. Emotionally, the aftermath of the flood carries profound resonance. Utnapishtim, after enduring the waters, experiences solitude, reflection, and the weight of responsibility. He is both survivor and custodian, embodying human resilience and moral duty. The psychological depth of these myths, fear, hope, loneliness, and ethical responsibility, creates a narrative richness that has captivated audiences for millennia. It is a story that speaks to universal human experiences, the fragility of life, the necessity of moral and practical action, and the enduring hope for renewal. By examining Mesopotamian flood myths alongside those from India, Egypt, the Americas, the Pacific, China, and Japan, a remarkable pattern emerges. Water becomes a universal symbol of both destruction and renewal. Human survival consistently depends on attentiveness, moral behavior, foresight, and cooperation. Divine or spiritual guidance appears in nearly every tradition, offering lessons that extend beyond immediate survival to encompass ethics, culture, and memory. Across continents and centuries, humanity has encoded its understanding of water's power into narrative, creating a shared human mythology of catastrophe and endurance. The Mesopotamian floods, with their epic scale, divine judgment, and moral depth, serve as a lens through which we can understand the universality of flood myths. They are more than stories. They are cultural memory, ethical guidance, and psychological preparation. They demonstrate that human beings, faced with overwhelming natural forces, respond with ingenuity, morality, and resilience, encoding these lessons into narratives that survive across millennia. In this context, the flood is both a literal and symbolic force. It destroys, tests, and renews, compelling humans to confront mortality, act with foresight, and preserve life. The myths remind us that survival is never purely physical. It is moral, intellectual, and communal. And in the final, receding waters, we glimpse the enduring human hope that even after destruction, life, knowledge, and culture can continue, resilient against the tides of time. In the forests, fjords, and river valleys of Central and Northern Europe, ancient flood myths carry echoes of catastrophe, resilience, and morality. The Norse, Germanic, and Celtic traditions preserve stories where water overwhelms the land, reshapes society, and tests human character. These tales, though less widely known than Mesopotamian or biblical accounts, reveal a fascinating interplay between human courage, divine guidance, and the raw force of nature. They also offer insight into how isolated communities perceived and responded to floods in a landscape marked by heavy rains, glacial rivers, and rising seas. Among the Norse, the flood often appears as part of the cosmic cycle. Legends speak of rivers breaking their banks or seas swelling beyond their bounds, threatening both gods and humans. The waters are chaotic and overwhelming, but survival depends on courage, cleverness, and the recognition of warning signs. In some myths, the flood is a precursor to Ragnarok, the ultimate destruction of the world, highlighting the intimate connection between human vulnerability and cosmic forces. These narratives intertwine morality, survival, and prophecy, showing that floods are never merely natural events. They are catalysts for transformation, moral reckoning, and spiritual reflection. The Germanic traditions, similarly, recount floods as tests of character and endurance. Humans must navigate treacherous rivers, seek refuge in highlands, or construct makeshift rafts to endure the rising waters. Communities are judged by their ability to cooperate, act ethically, and respond to divine or natural warnings. Those who fail succumb to the waters, while those who persevere embody the virtues of courage, foresight, and responsibility. In this way, the flood becomes a moral crucible, testing not only survival skills, but ethical conduct, reinforcing a universal theme found in nearly every flood myth around the world. Celtic myths add a mystical and symbolic dimension to floods. Waters often carry messages, act as boundaries between worlds, or serve as instruments of divine judgment. In some stories, rivers overflow as a result of human transgression or cosmic imbalance, washing away settlements and forcing migrations. Yet the flood is also transformative, enabling new growth, reshaping landscapes, and teaching communities the importance of harmony with nature and ethical behavior. The intertwining of natural disaster and moral instruction is a hallmark of European flood myths, echoing patterns seen in Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, the Americas, the Pacific, China, and Japan. Archaeological and geological evidence supports the plausibility of these floods. Northern Europe, with its glacial rivers and coastal deltas, has experienced sudden and catastrophic inundations throughout history. Sediment layers, submerged settlements, and ancient riverbeds reveal periods of dramatic flooding that likely inspired oral traditions. In this context, myths function as both historical memory and moral guidance, preserving knowledge of past events while teaching lessons about preparedness, cooperation, and ethical behavior. The flood becomes a bridge between lived experience and collective wisdom, encoded in narrative to guide future generations. Emotionally, the European flood myths are charged with tension, fear, and awe. Communities face overwhelming waters, uncertainty, and the potential loss of life and culture. Families cling to one another, communities scramble to adapt, and heroic figures or divine messengers guide survival. The flood serves as a stage upon which human courage, ingenuity, and moral integrity are tested. The stories evoke empathy, suspense, and admiration, creating a narrative rhythm that mirrors the rising and receding of the waters themselves. Audiences are drawn into both the physical and ethical stakes of survival. A striking motif in these myths is the preservation of culture and memory. Just as in Mesopotamian, Indian, Egyptian, and other flood narratives, survivors safeguard animals, seeds, and knowledge. High ground, rafts, or sanctuaries become vessels for life and wisdom, ensuring that civilization can continue after catastrophe. The flood, then, is both destructive and instructive, teaching communities how to endure, adapt, and thrive in the face of overwhelming natural forces. This duality, destruction and renewal, fear and hope, is central to the human fascination with floods across continents and epochs. European flood myths also emphasize the unpredictability of nature. Unlike some narratives where divine guidance or moral failure clearly triggers disaster. Floods in northern Europe often appear sudden and uncontrollable. This unpredictability heightens suspense and illustrates the fragility of human existence. Yet, even in the face of chaos, preparation, ethical conduct, and resilience offer a path to survival. Humans are small against the forces of nature, but they are not powerless. The myths teach that ingenuity, cooperation, and moral discernment can tip the balance in favor of life. Another compelling aspect is the emotional and spiritual depth embedded in the narratives. The flood tests not only survival skills, but psychological endurance and moral fortitude. The rising waters provoke fear, grief, and desperation, while the struggle to endure cultivates courage, perseverance, and ethical reflection. The aftermath is equally significant. Survivors carry memory, wisdom, and lessons forward, ensuring that culture, morality, and knowledge persist even after devastation. This continuity of human experience reinforces the universality of flood myths, connecting European traditions to the global tapestry of deluge narratives. Viewed in the broader context of world mythology, Northern and Central European floods illustrate recurring patterns. Overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or natural warning, survival, moral responsibility, and eventual renewal. These myths, while shaped by local landscapes and cultural perspectives, echo universal truths. Water tests, purifies, and teaches. Human responses, cooperation, foresight, courage, and ethical action are central to survival, forming a shared narrative across Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, the Americas, the Pacific, China, Japan, and Europe. By the conclusion of these European stories, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic. It destroys and renews, challenges and teaches, terrifies and inspires. Humans confront mortality, adapt, and preserve life, wisdom, and culture. The narratives leave a lasting impression. Survival is a test not only of physical endurance, but of moral integrity, communal cooperation, and attentiveness to the forces of nature. Across centuries and continents, floods remain a universal mirror, reflecting humanity's resilience, morality, and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming water. In the lush landscapes of South and Southeast Asia, beyond the Indian subcontinent, ancient civilizations preserve flood myths that reflect the region's monsoon rhythms, river systems, and spiritual worldviews. From the fertile deltas of the Mekong and Irrawaddy to the river plains of Thailand and Cambodia, water has always been both life-giving and destructive. The myths here emphasize cyclical floods, divine instruction, and human ingenuity, blending environmental observation with moral and spiritual lessons that resonate across generations. One recurring theme in these Southeast Asian narratives is the notion of cosmic balance. Floods are rarely random. They result from human or spiritual misalignment, ecological imbalance, or divine testing. Villages may be submerged because of greed, negligence, or moral failure, while those who act ethically, heed spiritual warnings, or show courage are preserved. Boats, floating houses, and elevated platforms often serve as vessels for survival, echoing the arcs of Noah, Utnapishtim, and Manu. The flood is both punishment and opportunity, emphasizing the intimate relationship between morality, survival, and harmony with nature. In some Thai and Cambodian legends, floodwaters are guided or mitigated by divine or ancestral spirits. These entities may provide warnings through dreams, visions, or natural omens. Farmers, villagers, or chosen leaders must interpret these signs correctly, demonstrating attentiveness and ethical discernment. Survival is thus contingent on both practical preparation and moral action, reinforcing the idea that human life is inseparable from responsibility, wisdom, and spiritual awareness. This blend of pragmatism and morality is a hallmark of Southeast Asian flood myths, offering lessons that extend beyond immediate survival to encompass cultural and ethical continuity. The scale of the floods described in these stories is immense. Rivers swell beyond their banks, fields vanish beneath water, and entire settlements are forced to evacuate. Communities scramble to preserve crops, livestock, and sacred objects, reflecting both the practical and symbolic aspects of survival. In many tales, particular families or leaders rise as figures of courage and ingenuity, organizing collective action to navigate the deluge. The narratives emphasize that endurance is rarely an individual feat. It requires communal effort, foresight, and moral integrity, mirroring global flood traditions while highlighting regional cultural values. Archaeological and geological evidence in the Mekong, Irrawaddy, and Chao Phraya river basins supports the plausibility of these myths. Sediment layers, ancient water channels, and records of historical flooding suggest that communities faced repeated inundations that reshaped settlements, agriculture, and trade. Oral traditions likely encoded practical survival strategies, environmental knowledge, and moral lessons, preserving them in narrative form for future generations. The myths are both instructive and symbolic, bridging lived experience with spiritual and ethical frameworks. Emotionally, these Southeast Asian floods are intense and layered. The rising waters create fear, tension, and a profound sense of vulnerability. Families cling together, communities mobilize, and leaders must act decisively. The flood tests patience, courage, and moral judgment. Unlike myths focused solely on divine punishment, these stories often stress human agency, collaboration, and strategic action. The waters are both destructive and instructive, challenging humans to understand natural rhythms, act ethically, and preserve life in all its forms. One notable motif in these myths is the preservation of biodiversity and culture. Just as in Mesopotamian, Indian, Egyptian, Pacific, Chinese, Japanese, and European stories, survivors safeguard animals, seeds, knowledge, and sacred objects. Boats, rafts, or elevated shelters serve as lifelines, ensuring continuity after the catastrophe. The flood becomes a vehicle for moral and practical lessons. Humanity's survival depends on attentiveness, cooperation, foresight, and ethical conduct. The water tests, teaches, and transforms, reinforcing universal human experiences while highlighting regional distinctiveness. Cultural and spiritual symbolism is also prominent. Floods often act as purifiers, washing away corruption, imbalance, or negligence. Divine or ancestral guidance emphasizes the ethical dimension of survival, while the eventual reseeding of waters signifies renewal, opportunity, and moral restoration. The narratives teach that water is both adversary and teacher, demanding courage, wisdom, and respect for forces beyond human control. In this way, the flood is not just a disaster, but a profound metaphor for life's fragility, responsibility, and potential for rebirth. Emotionally and psychologically, the aftermath is as significant as the deluge itself. Survivors must rebuild, adapt, and maintain moral and cultural integrity. The flood leaves lessons etched in memory. Vigilance, cooperation, and ethical behavior are essential to endure future challenges. This focus on post-disaster restoration mirrors other global traditions, connecting Southeast Asian myths to the broader human experience with water, survival, and morality. Viewed alongside global flood myths from Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, the Americas, the Pacific, China, Japan, and Europe, Southeast Asian narratives reinforce recurring themes: overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or spiritual guidance, survival, moral responsibility, and eventual renewal. The stories are culturally distinct yet resonate universally, illustrating that humanity has always sought to understand, endure, and learn from the overwhelming power of water. By the conclusion of these tales, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic. It destroys and purifies, challenges and instructs, terrifies and inspires. Communities confront mortality, act ethically, and preserve life, culture, and wisdom. The narratives leave a lasting impression. Survival is not merely physical. It is moral, social, and spiritual. Across centuries and continents, floods remain a universal mirror, reflecting humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and ethical consciousness in the face of overwhelming natural forces. Across the vast landscapes of the Americas, from the frozen north to the tropical rainforests and highland valleys of Central and South America, flood myths carry powerful lessons of survival, morality, and renewal. Indigenous cultures, intimately attuned to rivers, lakes, and seasonal storms, develop stories that intertwine human action with cosmic forces. These myths, preserved through oral tradition, painting, and ritual, reveal humanity's age-old struggle to survive and understand the overwhelming power of water. In North America, numerous Native American tribes recount catastrophic floods as pivotal events. Among the Cree, Ojibwe, and Hopi, tales describe waters rising to engulf the land, destroying villages, and testing the resolve of humanity. In many narratives, a single individual or family survives by floating on a log, canoe, or constructed vessel. Survival requires courage, obedience to spiritual guidance, and cooperation with animals or divine beings. Just as in Mesopotamia, China, or India, the flood is both a literal threat and a moral crucible, compelling humans to act wisely and ethically in the face of overwhelming natural forces. In Central America, the Mayan and Aztec traditions present floods as consequences of imbalance between humans and gods, or between human behavior and the natural world. The Popol Vuh, the sacred Mayan text, recounts how early humans were destroyed by water due to their imperfections, with only a few surviving to restore order. These narratives emphasize moral responsibility, spiritual alignment, and the consequences of hubris. Water becomes a transformative force, capable of erasing civilizations, yet offering opportunities for rebirth, echoing patterns seen across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Asia. South American myths, particularly among Andean and Amazonian peoples, also highlight the dual nature of floods, destruction and renewal. Rivers overflowing during seasonal rains are both feared and revered. Stories recount divine beings instructing humans to preserve seeds, animals, or sacred knowledge, ensuring continuity after the waters recede. The flood is framed as a teacher, a mirror of human behavior, and a test of ingenuity, cooperation, and ethical action. The recurring motifs, boats, animals, divine warning, and moral instruction, link the Americas to a global tapestry of flood narratives. Archaeological and geological evidence supports the possibility of catastrophic floods in the Americas. Ancient settlements along the Mississippi, Amazon, and Andes reveal layers of sediment indicative of sudden inundations. Oral traditions likely preserve these memories, transforming them into stories that convey both practical survival strategies and ethical lessons. The myths encode knowledge essential for enduring floods: observation, cooperation, foresight, and respect for forces beyond human control. They serve as both historical memory and moral instruction, bridging lived experience with narrative wisdom. Emotionally, these myths are intense and immersive. Families face fear, uncertainty, and the potential loss of life and culture. Communities are challenged to act collectively, follow spiritual guidance, and preserve essential knowledge. Heroes emerge, whether human, divine, or animal, demonstrating courage, intelligence, and moral integrity. The flood is not just a physical event. It is a psychological and ethical trial, testing patience, resilience, and the ability to act in harmony with the natural and spiritual world. These emotional stakes mirror other global flood traditions, creating universality in human experience. A distinctive feature of American flood myths is the integration of animals as active participants in survival. Beavers, turtles, birds, and other creatures often assist humans in escaping the rising waters or restoring life afterward. These animals are not merely symbolic. They represent the interconnection between humans and the natural world, emphasizing cooperation, respect, and ecological wisdom. The narrative reinforces the lesson that survival is inseparable from ethical interaction with the environment and its inhabitants, a theme that resonates globally yet is uniquely expressed in the Americas. Another prominent motif is the preservation of knowledge and culture. Survivors safeguard seeds, tools, rituals, and sacred objects, ensuring continuity after the catastrophe. The flood becomes both destructive and instructive, a vehicle for teaching foresight, ethical conduct, and communal responsibility. Across the Americas, the narratives emphasize that human survival relies on wisdom, moral action, and collaboration, rather than mere luck or divine favor. The water tests character, endurance, and ethical discernment, leaving lasting lessons for future generations. These myths also convey the cyclical nature of floods, reflecting the region's seasonal patterns. Rising rivers, monsoon rains, and glacial melt are interpreted as part of a larger natural order, demanding attentiveness, preparation, and respect. Humans are depicted as participants in a dynamic relationship with water, rather than passive victims. The narratives stress that observation, ethical behavior, and communal cooperation are essential to survive the deluge and restore balance afterward. Viewed alongside global flood myths from Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, the Pacific, China, Japan, Europe, and Southeast Asia, the Americas reveal recurring motifs. Overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or spiritual guidance, survival, moral responsibility, and eventual renewal. The stories are culturally distinct yet resonate universally, demonstrating humanity's enduring effort to understand, endure, and learn from water's immense power. By the end of these tales, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic. It destroys and tests, purifies and instructs, terrifies and inspires. Humans confront mortality, act ethically, preserve life, and transmit knowledge. The narratives leave a lasting impression. Survival is not merely physical. It is moral, social, and spiritual. Across continents and centuries, floods remain a universal mirror, reflecting humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and ethical consciousness in the face of overwhelming natural forces. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, islands scattered like emerald jewels are home to some of the most extraordinary and diverse flood myths in human history. From Polynesia to Micronesia and Melanesia, these narratives reflect communities intimately aware of the ocean's moods, tides, and storms. Here, water is both lifeblood and threat, capable of sustaining life, yet capable of obliterating villages, crops, and entire islands. The myths of the Pacific Islanders blend survival, divine guidance, and cultural continuity, producing stories that are as morally instructive as they are breathtakingly dramatic. In Polynesian traditions, floods often emerge as direct consequences of divine displeasure or imbalance in human behavior. Villages may be submerged because of greed, disrespect toward gods, or failure to honor sacred rituals. Yet, as in other flood myths, a chosen individual or family is typically spared, guided by divine insight or ancestral wisdom. In some stories, survival comes through a constructed canoe, elevated platform, or floating raft, preserving humans, animals, and cultural knowledge. The narrative tension is palpable. The waters rise inexorably, testing courage, morality, and ingenuity. The emotional resonance of these myths is profound. Imagine communities huddled together as ocean waves surge over the land. Sacred places vanish beneath water, and familiar landscapes are transformed. Fear, hope, and moral responsibility intertwine. The survivor, guided by intuition or divine instruction, becomes both hero and custodian, carrying the weight of ensuring life continues. Knowledge is preserved, and culture survives. The flood is not merely a physical event. It is a trial of character, patience, and ethical discernment, echoing the motifs of Utnapishtim, Noah, You the Great, and other legendary figures. In Melanesian myths, floods are often linked to ecological cycles, such as monsoon rains or cyclones. Communities interpret these events as both literal and symbolic, understanding that survival depends on observing nature, preparing in advance, and respecting ancestral or spiritual guidance. Human ingenuity is celebrated. Elevated dwellings, storage of seeds, and collaborative rescue efforts highlight adaptive strategies that allow communities to endure repeated inundations. The narrative emphasizes that survival is never purely about luck. It requires moral integrity, foresight, and coordinated effort. Micronesian legends add a fascinating dimension. Animals frequently play active roles in survival. Birds may guide humans to higher ground. Fish may help identify safe waterways, and ancestral spirits may inhabit natural landmarks to provide warning. This integration of humans, animals, and spiritual forces underscores the interconnectedness of all life, highlighting a moral framework where survival is contingent upon cooperation, ethical action, and attentiveness to the environment. The flood becomes a stage upon which human ingenuity, ecological wisdom, and moral responsibility converge. Geographically, the Pacific Islands are acutely vulnerable to flooding. High tides, cyclones, tsunamis, and rising seas have repeatedly forced communities to adapt. Oral traditions, preserved through storytelling, songs, and ritual, encode knowledge of past disasters, survival strategies, and moral lessons. These myths serve as living archives, teaching subsequent generations to respect the ocean, act ethically, and preserve life. They are both historical record and moral compass, a dual role echoed in flood narratives across the globe. Emotionally, the rising waters evoke fear, uncertainty, and awe. Villages vanish, crops are lost, and survival hinges on attentiveness, courage, and cooperation. Communities rely on collective wisdom, guidance from elders or spiritual entities, and careful observation of natural signs. The flood becomes a crucible for human character, testing moral fiber as much as physical endurance. The tension between destruction and hope, peril and ingenuity, mirrors the dramatic arcs of other ancient flood myths, maintaining universal relevance while highlighting Pacific Island cultural specificity. A recurring motif in Pacific myths is the preservation of life and culture. Survivors safeguard seeds, animals, sacred objects, and oral histories. Canoes, rafts, or elevated platforms are vessels not just for physical survival, but for continuity of tradition. The flood tests both ingenuity and morality, reinforcing the idea that human action, ethical conduct, and cultural responsibility are inseparable from survival. Water is both adversary and teacher, challenging humanity to endure, adapt, and preserve wisdom for future generations. Symbolically, floods in Pacific Island myths are often transformative. Destruction makes way for renewal, cleansing the land and testing the moral and practical resolve of survivors. Communities emerge wiser, more cooperative, and more respectful of natural and spiritual forces. The narrative teaches that survival is never a solitary endeavor. It is communal, ethical, and intertwined with environmental awareness. Like Chinese, Japanese, Southeast Asian, and American myths, Pacific stories frame floods as catalysts for renewal rather than purely catastrophic events. Viewed alongside global flood myths, Pacific Island narratives reveal recurring motifs: overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or spiritual guidance, survival, moral responsibility, and eventual renewal. They are culturally distinct yet universally resonant, demonstrating humanity's enduring effort to understand, endure, and learn from water's immense power. Across centuries and continents, these myths remind us that survival is as much about moral and ethical action as it is about physical endurance. By the conclusion of these tales, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic. It destroys and purifies, challenges and instructs, terrifies and inspires. Humans confront mortality, act ethically, and preserve life, culture, and wisdom. The narratives leave a lasting impression. Survival is never merely physical. It is moral, social, and spiritual. Across the Pacific and the world, floods remain a universal mirror, reflecting humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and ethical consciousness in the face of overwhelming natural forces. Across the vast continent of Africa, flood myths occupy a central place in the cultural and spiritual imagination, blending human experience with divine instruction, cosmic order, and environmental observation. From the Nile Delta in Egypt to the rivers and lakes of sub-Saharan Africa, communities have long contended with seasonal inundations, unpredictable rains, and catastrophic floods. These stories reveal a profound understanding of water's dual nature: life-giving yet potentially devastating, sacred yet uncontrollable. African flood myths intertwine survival, morality, and spiritual guidance in ways that echo global traditions while reflecting the unique cultural and ecological landscapes of the continent. In Egypt, floods are closely tied to the life-giving cycles of the Nile. The annual inundation, though anticipated, was both awe-inspiring and potentially destructive. The Nile's waters enriched the soil, sustaining agriculture. Yet when the floods failed or rose beyond expectation, communities faced famine, destruction, and uncertainty. Mythology intertwined with observation. Gods such as Hapi were believed to control the floodwaters, rewarding human obedience, devotion, and proper ritual. Survival, therefore, was both practical and spiritual. Communities had to anticipate, prepare, and honor the divine forces governing water. The Nile floods became a recurring narrative of abundance, warning, and moral accountability, shaping Egyptian understanding of life, order, and resilience. Beyond Egypt, sub-Saharan African flood myths often emphasize morality, divine retribution, and human ingenuity. Communities describe vast rivers overflowing, villages submerged, and humans forced to seek refuge in elevated lands or construct floating shelters. Often, a single individual, family, or group is chosen to survive, guided by ancestral spirits, gods, or natural signs. In some myths, animals assist humans in escaping the rising waters, symbolizing cooperation between humans and nature. Survival hinges on ethical behavior, attentiveness, and courage, emphasizing that floods are not merely natural events, but moral and spiritual tests. Emotionally, African flood narratives carry intense drama and suspense. The rising waters evoke fear, desperation, and awe. Families cling together, communities organize, and leaders must demonstrate courage, wisdom, and ethical integrity. The flood tests both physical endurance and moral resolve, compelling humans to act decisively to preserve life, knowledge, and culture. These emotional stakes mirror patterns seen across global flood myths, from Mesopotamia to China, Japan, the Americas, and the Pacific, highlighting humanity's universal struggle against water's overwhelming force. One prominent motif is the preservation of life and knowledge. Just as in other flood traditions, survivors safeguard animals, crops, seeds, sacred objects, and oral histories. Rafts, canoes, or high ground serve as vessels for both physical and cultural survival. The flood becomes a vehicle for moral, practical, and spiritual lessons. Attentive observation, cooperative action, and ethical decision-making are critical to endure catastrophe. African myths, like those of other regions, encode survival strategies and moral guidance, preserving collective wisdom for generations. In some sub-Saharan stories, floods carry transformative power. They cleanse the land, wash away human hubris or misbehavior, and provide opportunities for renewal. Communities emerge wiser, more cooperative, and spiritually attuned. Water acts as both destroyer and teacher, emphasizing the necessity of harmony between humans, nature, and the spiritual world. These narratives illustrate a recurring pattern in flood myths globally: disaster as instruction, destruction as renewal, and survival as a combination of courage, ingenuity, and moral integrity. Archaeological and geological evidence supports the plausibility of historical floods across Africa. The Nile Delta, the Niger River Basin, and parts of East Africa experienced dramatic inundations that shaped settlement patterns, agriculture, and trade. Oral traditions likely preserve these experiences, embedding practical strategies for survival, ethical guidance, and collective memory in narrative form. The myths are simultaneously historical, moral, and instructive, bridging lived experience with enduring cultural wisdom. Emotionally and psychologically, the aftermath of the flood is as important as the deluge itself. Survivors rebuild, reflect, and transmit lessons to future generations. Families, communities, and leaders must adapt to changed landscapes, reestablish social order, and ensure continuity of culture, morality, and knowledge. The flood tests more than survival skills. It challenges resilience, ethical behavior, and communal responsibility. The narratives leave a lasting imprint, teaching that life's continuity depends on vigilance, morality, and collaboration. Viewed alongside global flood myths, African stories reinforce universal motifs: overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or ancestral guidance, survival, ethical responsibility, and renewal. Yet they are culturally distinct, reflecting Africa's ecological diversity, spiritual cosmology, and moral frameworks. From the fertile Nile Valley to sub-Saharan rivers, the narratives convey a holistic understanding of floods as natural, moral, and spiritual phenomena, a perspective that resonates with other ancient cultures yet remains uniquely African. By the end of these tales, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic. It destroys, purifies, instructs, and transforms. Humans confront mortality, act ethically, preserve life, and carry knowledge forward. The narratives leave a lasting impression. Survival is never merely physical. It is moral, social, and spiritual. Across Africa and the world, floods remain a universal mirror, reflecting humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and ethical consciousness in the face of overwhelming natural forces. Beyond the well-known Mesopotamian and biblical accounts, the Middle East holds a treasure trove of lesser-known flood myths that hint at an intricate tapestry of cultural memory, divine warning, and human resilience. In the arid lands of the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and surrounding regions, floods were less frequent than in riverine civilizations. Yet when they occurred, they were cataclysmic, leaving an indelible mark on collective memory. These narratives preserve both cautionary lessons and ethical guidance, illustrating how water, even in desert landscapes, shaped human imagination and survival strategies. Arabian flood myths often center on sudden, violent inundations, flash floods caused by torrential rains in otherwise dry valleys. The narratives describe entire settlements swept away, crops destroyed, and humans struggling to survive. In these tales, a hero or wise individual is frequently forewarned by a divine or ancestral message, giving them the opportunity to construct a vessel, climb to higher ground, or organize a community escape. Survival is contingent on foresight, moral discernment, and obedience to spiritual guidance, echoing motifs familiar from Mesopotamian, Indian, and Pacific Islander flood traditions. Emotionally, the Arabian flood myths are intense, emphasizing fear, suspense, and human courage. Families cling together as waters rise unpredictably. The landscape transforms, and death looms. Communities must act collectively, demonstrating leadership, cooperation, and moral integrity. The flood is a crucible, testing human character as much as physical endurance. This emotional resonance reflects a universal human concern. Water is simultaneously a life-giver and a destroyer, demanding vigilance, ethical action, and resilience. In the Levant, flood myths are often intertwined with divine morality and ethical lessons. Local legends describe how human arrogance, neglect, or cruelty can provoke catastrophic floods. Just as in Mesopotamia and Egypt, selected survivors, guided by divine insight, preserve life, knowledge, and sacred artifacts. The flood is framed as a moral reckoning, emphasizing that survival is not only a matter of physical endurance, but also of ethical behavior. Humans are accountable for their actions, and the rising waters serve as both punishment and teacher. Geologically, the Middle East is no stranger to sudden, destructive floods. Ancient riverbeds, seasonal wadis, and historical records reveal dramatic flash floods that could submerge settlements in hours. These events likely inspired oral traditions, transforming raw experience into moral and spiritual narrative. Flood myths thus function as both historical memory and ethical instruction, encoding survival strategies, cultural continuity, and moral reflection for generations to come. A distinctive feature of Middle Eastern flood myths is the emphasis on divine or ancestral communication. Warnings are often symbolic. Dreams, visions, or signs in nature convey critical information to potential survivors. Interpretation and timely action are crucial. In this way, humans are not passive victims of water's force. They're active participants, required to act ethically, wisely, and cooperatively. This interplay of morality, foresight, and survival reinforces a recurring global theme. Humanity's relationship with floods is inseparable from ethics, communal responsibility, and attentiveness to natural and spiritual signals. Emotionally and psychologically, these narratives explore the tension between inevitability and agency. The waters rise relentlessly, threatening life and reshaping landscapes. Yet humans retain a measure of control through ethical choices, clever action, and cooperation. This duality, fear and empowerment, creates suspense, empathy, and engagement, drawing audiences into the human struggle. Heroes emerge not only through physical bravery, but also through moral integrity, wisdom, and leadership, providing archetypal models that resonate across cultures and epochs. A recurring motif in Middle Eastern myths is the preservation of knowledge and culture. Survivors safeguard sacred objects, seeds, tools, and oral histories, ensuring continuity after catastrophe. The flood is both destructive and instructive, teaching foresight, moral responsibility, and cooperation. Water is simultaneously adversary and teacher, shaping human behavior, ethics, and societal structures. These stories highlight a universal truth. Survival depends on more than strength. It relies on insight, morality, and collaborative effort. Some Middle Eastern flood myths also explore the aftermath of destruction. The landscape is transformed, communities must rebuild, and survivors carry the weight of memory, wisdom, and ethical responsibility. The narrative tension shifts from immediate survival to reconstruction, reflection, and cultural preservation. Humans learn from catastrophe, adapt to new circumstances, and transmit essential knowledge, demonstrating the enduring role of flood myths in encoding human experience, ethics, and resilience. Viewed alongside global flood narratives from Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, the Americas, the Pacific, China, Japan, Europe, and Africa, Middle Eastern myths reinforce universal patterns. Overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or spiritual guidance, survival, moral responsibility, and eventual renewal. Yet they retain regional specificity, reflecting the arid landscapes, cultural frameworks, and ethical systems of the Middle East. These myths illuminate how water, even in comparatively dry regions, shapes human imagination, morality, and survival strategies. By the conclusion of these stories, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic. It destroys, purifies, instructs, and transforms. Humans confront mortality, act ethically, preserve life, and transmit knowledge across generations. The narratives leave a lasting impression. Survival is never merely physical. It is moral, social, and spiritual. Across the Middle East and the world, floods remain a universal mirror, reflecting humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and ethical consciousness in the face of overwhelming natural forces. As we traverse the globe, a startling pattern emerges. Despite vast geographical distances and cultural differences, flood myths share remarkable similarities. From Mesopotamia to the Pacific, from Africa to the Americas, humans have repeatedly told stories of overwhelming waters, chosen survivors, divine guidance, and the preservation of life. This convergence raises a tantalizing question. Are these myths mere coincidence, or do they reveal a shared human consciousness, ancient memories, or even forgotten events etched into the collective imagination? The answer is as mysterious as the floods themselves. One of the most striking recurring motifs is the ark or vessel of survival. Whether it is Utnapishtim's massive boat, Noah's Ark, Manu's rescue vessel, or the Pacific Islander canoes, humanity's stories converge on the idea that survival requires foresight, preparation, and ethical action. The vessels are rarely just physical constructs. They symbolize moral responsibility and the safeguarding of life, knowledge, and culture. In nearly every tradition, the flood is a test of character as much as a natural catastrophe, highlighting a universal human understanding. To endure, one must act wisely, ethically, and cooperatively. Animals are another unifying element. Pairs of creatures, symbolic or literal, accompany survivors, ensuring continuity of species and demonstrating the interconnectedness of life. In African, American, and Pacific myths, animals play active roles, guiding humans, assisting in escape, or providing moral lessons. This motif underscores a global ethic. Humanity is part of a larger ecosystem, and survival depends on cooperation and respect for the natural world. Across cultures, water becomes both a destructive and instructive force, and animals embody the wisdom required to navigate it. Divine or spiritual guidance is consistently present. In Mesopotamian, Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, and African myths, the chosen survivors receive warnings through visions, dreams, omens, or direct communication from deities. These divine messages are seldom arbitrary. They demand interpretation, moral discernment, and timely action. Humanity's ability to heed these warnings is central to survival, reflecting a universal narrative thread. Catastrophe is not random, but morally instructive, requiring vigilance, wisdom, and ethical engagement. The flood becomes both test and teacher, shaping human behavior and societal norms. Geographically and environmentally, many scholars suggest that these myths may encode memories of real catastrophic events. Rising sea levels, glacial melts, tsunamis, and massive river floods could have left an imprint on early civilizations. The repetition of similar motifs, the ark, selected survivors, paired animals, divine warnings, across continents might indicate shared human experiences of extreme flooding, preserved in narrative form. Oral traditions, handed down over generations, transform observation into myth, embedding survival strategies, moral guidance, and ethical frameworks into collective memory. Emotionally, these myths resonate deeply. Floods evoke fear, suspense, awe, and ethical reflection. Survivors bear responsibility for life, culture, and knowledge. The water is simultaneously terrifying and instructive, forcing humans to confront mortality while demonstrating courage, ingenuity, and morality. The narratives are psychologically rich, capturing vulnerability, resilience, grief, hope, and moral deliberation. Across continents and epochs, humans have encoded these emotional and ethical lessons into stories that remain powerful to this day. Another recurring theme is renewal and transformation. Floods rarely mark an absolute end. They wash away the old, challenge humanity, and allow for rebirth. Landscapes, communities, and even moral orders are reshaped, symbolizing both physical and ethical renewal. Survivors become custodians of life, knowledge, and cultural memory. This pattern is remarkably consistent across global myths, suggesting a shared understanding of catastrophe as both destructive and instructive, terrifying yet full of potential for new beginnings. Ethical responsibility is central in nearly all flood myths. Humans are punished or tested for transgressions, greed, arrogance, neglect, or disobedience. Survival requires attentiveness, moral integrity, and cooperation. Across continents, The flood is never a mere natural event. It is a moral crucible. These stories encode a universal principle. To endure catastrophe, humanity must act responsibly, ethically, and with foresight. The flood becomes a mirror reflecting human behavior, morality, and communal values, teaching lessons that transcend geography and time. Psychologically, the flood myths address both fear and hope. They confront humanity with mortality, overwhelming forces, and the fragility of life, yet simultaneously provide strategies for endurance, moral guidance, and ethical clarity. The tension between destruction and renewal, despair and resilience, chaos and order, creates narrative suspense and emotional resonance. Audiences are drawn into both the physical and moral stakes, connecting with the stories on deeply human terms. Viewed globally, flood myths reveal patterns too consistent to ignore. Overwhelming waters, moral tests, chosen survivors, preservation of life, divine guidance, animal cooperation, and eventual renewal. The recurrence suggests that humanity, regardless of geography or culture, has been united by the challenge of water, its power, unpredictability, and moral implications. These myths function as survival guides, ethical compasses, and cultural anchors, demonstrating that the story of the flood is not only about water, but about humanity itself. By synthesizing these narratives, we begin to see a hidden network of human experience stretching across millennia and continents. Flood myths are more than local legends. They are windows into collective memory, ethical frameworks, and the universal struggle to survive overwhelming forces. They reveal a shared human consciousness, reflecting our fears, hopes, moral reasoning, and ingenuity. Across cultures, the flood stands as a symbol of destruction, instruction, and renewal, binding humanity together in an ancient narrative that continues to captivate and instruct. Amid the universal threads of flood myths, a haunting question emerges. Could these stories hint at civilizations lost beneath the waters, cities swallowed by seas, entire cultures erased from memory? Across the world, legends speak of sunken lands, vanished islands, and drowned kingdoms, and modern archaeology occasionally offers tantalizing glimpses that spark both intrigue and speculation. The idea that humanity's collective memory preserves traces of cataclysmic events adds an enigmatic twist to the familiar narrative of flood and survival. In the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, legends abound of islands submerged by rising waters. The mythical kingdom of Lemuria, Atlantis in the Atlantic, and Kumari Kandam in Tamil lore are described as advanced civilizations that vanished beneath the waves. Stories speak of towering structures, intricate waterways, and sophisticated societies that disappeared overnight, leaving only myth behind. While many consider these accounts allegorical, the consistency of details and their recurrence across distant cultures hint at a deeper resonance, a memory of catastrophic flooding, preserved through storytelling and cultural transmission. Archaeological discoveries lend further intrigue. Submerged ruins off the coast of India, Sri Lanka, and Japan suggest that rising seas and tectonic activity may have engulfed settlements thousands of years ago. In the Mediterranean, evidence of submerged ports and ancient harbors hints at dramatic shifts in coastline and water levels. Could these events have seeded flood myths, encoding memories of lost civilizations into narrative form? The parallels with flood legends, from Utnapishtim's city in Mesopotamia to the Americas' ancestral settlements, are striking, suggesting that myth and history may intersect in ways we are only beginning to understand. Emotionally, the idea of lost civilizations resonates profoundly. Imagine entire cities vanishing beneath waves, generations erased, and human ingenuity swallowed by the sea. Survivors of these events, or their descendants, preserved memory in story, song, and ritual, passing lessons to future generations. The flood becomes both physical and symbolic. It is destruction on a cosmic scale, yet it also preserves wisdom, ethics, and cultural memory through narrative. The emotional stakes, loss, resilience, curiosity, and awe remain as compelling today as they were in antiquity. Submerged landscapes are often linked to moral and ethical dimensions in myth. Many legends suggest that hubris, greed, or moral failure triggered the cataclysm. Cities that once flourished now lie hidden, serving as eternal warnings. Archaeological evidence sometimes aligns with these accounts. Advanced settlements, now underwater, indicate sophisticated planning, artistry, and culture, raising questions about the forces that destroyed them. The flood, therefore, is more than a natural event. It is a test of human behavior, judgment, and responsibility, linking catastrophe with ethics across time and geography. In the Americas, too, oral traditions describe sunken cities and drowned lands. The Yucatan Peninsula, the Caribbean, and the Amazon basin feature myths of lost civilizations, sometimes called cities of gold, or sacred lands swallowed by rivers and lakes. Survivors are often described as carrying knowledge, seeds, or sacred artifacts to safer lands, ensuring continuity despite the overwhelming destruction. The narrative is familiar: floods as divine or natural punishment, moral tests, and instruments of renewal. Yet the added dimension of lost civilizations deepens the mystery, suggesting humanity once faced not just local catastrophes, but widespread, transformative events. The psychological impact of these myths is profound. They blend awe, fear, and curiosity, compelling listeners to imagine worlds erased by water. The tension between loss and preservation, destruction and continuity, creates compelling narratives that linger in memory. These stories are not only entertainment. They serve as moral instruction, ethical reflection, and collective memory. Humanity, confronted with water's immense power, encodes both survival strategies and cautionary tales into the myths, ensuring that future generations remain vigilant, respectful, and ethically conscious. Technological and cultural parallels across myths are equally fascinating. Sunken cities are described with advanced architecture, complex social systems, and knowledge of engineering, agriculture, and navigation. Whether Atlantis in the Atlantic, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, or submerged ruins in the Mediterranean, the stories suggest civilizations capable of remarkable achievement, yet vulnerable to nature's overwhelming force. The consistency of these motifs across continents implies that flood myths may preserve echoes of real historical catastrophes, transformed into narrative through memory, ritual, and cultural transmission. The idea of lost civilizations beneath water also deepens the moral dimension of floods. Survivors, whether literal or symbolic, carry the responsibility of transmitting knowledge, ethical guidance, and cultural memory. Water tests human resilience, courage, and morality, yet also safeguards the wisdom of the past, ensuring continuity despite catastrophe. These myths reinforce a universal theme. Survival is not merely physical. It is intellectual, ethical, and cultural. Human memory, encoded in story, becomes the art-preserving civilization's essence, even when cities themselves vanish. Viewed in a global context, the twist of lost flood civilizations enriches the tapestry of human flood myths. From Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, and the Americas to the Pacific, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, the narratives converge on shared motifs. Overwhelming water, human vulnerability, divine or moral guidance, survival, and renewal. The additional layer of vanished cities suggests that these myths may preserve not only moral and survival lessons, but also fragments of ancient history, offering a bridge between the known and the mysterious, between memory and archaeology, between story and lost reality. By the conclusion of these legends, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic, immediate and far-reaching. It destroys, purifies, instructs, and transforms. Lost civilizations become eternal warnings and reservoirs of wisdom, teaching humanity resilience, morality, and ingenuity. Across the world, floods are mirrors of human experience, reflecting our vulnerabilities, ethical challenges, curiosity, and capacity for renewal. They remind us that even in catastrophe, knowledge and culture can endure, leaving traces for those willing to look beneath the waves. As we reach the penultimate stage of our journey through flood myths, the question arises: could science, geology, and archaeology provide clues to the extraordinary consistency of these stories? Across continents, floods are depicted with uncanny similarity, and modern research suggests that many of these myths may reflect real events: catastrophic floods, rising seas, and shifting rivers, imprinted on human memory and passed down through generations. The intersection of myth and science reveals a thrilling possibility. These legends may encode ancient experiences of environmental upheaval, preserved not only in stone and sediment, but in human consciousness itself. Geological evidence is compelling. Sediment layers across Mesopotamia, the Nile Delta, the Indus Valley, and the Americas indicate massive floods in antiquity. Core samples reveal sudden deposits, sometimes spanning hundreds of kilometers, suggesting rapid inundations. Submerged settlements, from coastal Japan to the Mediterranean, hint at dramatic sea level changes and tsunamis. In North and South America, ancient river terraces and lake deposits indicate sudden rises in water levels that could have inspired catastrophic flood stories. Across Asia, Pacific Islands, Africa, and Europe, the land itself preserves traces of dramatic water events, often correlating with timelines suggested by local myths. Some scientists propose that rising post-ice age seas, tectonic activity, and glacial melt contributed to global inundations. Coastal settlements would have been among the first affected, leaving only oral memories passed to inland communities. Over centuries, these memories transformed into myth, retaining motifs such as arcs, paired animals, chosen survivors, and divine warnings. In this light, flood myths become a bridge between environmental reality and human narrative, encoding not just survival strategies, but moral, ethical, and spiritual lessons. Archaeology further illuminates these connections. Submerged cities off India, Sri Lanka, and Japan show evidence of sudden abandonment, suggesting a combination of rising seas, tsunamis, and catastrophic flooding. The Mediterranean and North Sea coasts reveal ancient ports and settlements now underwater. Even in the Americas, archaeological sites indicate communities displaced by river floods or coastal submersion. These discoveries raise a fascinating possibility. Myths may preserve fragmented memory of real civilizations affected by cataclysmic water events, transformed over generations into narrative, allegory, and ethical instruction. The emotional power of these stories becomes even more evident when considered alongside scientific findings. Imagine the terror of an unprepared community confronted with sudden, devastating waters, or the awe at witnessing familiar lands swallowed by the sea. Flood myths encode these experiences: fear, resilience, hope, and morality, ensuring they are remembered long after the physical events have passed. Human emotion becomes intertwined with environmental observation, moral reflection, and narrative creativity, producing myths that resonate across cultures and epochs. A recurring theme in both myth and science is the concept of moral and ethical testing. Floods are not random disasters. They challenge human behavior, cooperation, and ethical decision-making. Myths encode survival strategies, observe natural signs, act cooperatively, preserve knowledge, and respect the forces of nature. Scientific investigation of past floods reinforces these narratives, showing that communities that adapted effectively could endure, migrate, and thrive, while those unprepared often disappeared. Myth and reality converge in a narrative of ethics, resilience, and environmental awareness. Tectonic events, volcanic eruptions, and sudden climatic changes may also explain global flood stories. Megatsunamis in the Mediterranean, seismic sea waves in the Pacific, and glacial outbursts in Asia or Europe could have left an imprint on human communities. Survivors would naturally pass down accounts of catastrophic waters, encoding both practical survival lessons and moral reflections. Over generations, these events became mythicized, embellished with divine guidance, ethical imperatives, and symbolic animals. The flood, therefore, is simultaneously geological, ethical, and spiritual, a multidimensional force shaping human imagination. Psychologically, flood myths address both fear and hope, mortality and resilience. The waters represent uncontrollable natural power, challenging humans to confront their vulnerability. Yet they also offer opportunity. The survival of the wise, moral, and prepared ensures continuity. In this way, myths function as collective memory, ethical instruction, and emotional processing, preserving humanity's experiences of disaster while offering guidance for future generations. Floods are simultaneously destructive and instructive, terrifying yet morally illuminating. Viewed globally, the interplay between myth, science, and archaeology is remarkable. Sediment layers, submerged ruins, and climatic data correlate with the motifs of arcs, selected survivors, divine warnings, and post-flood renewal. Across continents, humanity's repeated storytelling of floods may be interpreted as an ancient attempt to encode environmental, moral, and practical knowledge. The remarkable consistency of these narratives suggests that myths are not arbitrary. They preserve fragments of reality filtered through collective memory, spiritual reflection, and moral reasoning. By the end of this section, the flood emerges as both literal and symbolic, historical and mythic. It destroys, instructs, and transforms, leaving traces in sediment, ruins, and human consciousness. Science and archaeology illuminate the potential origins of these stories, revealing the deep interconnection between humans and their environment. Yet myth preserves the emotional, ethical, and spiritual dimensions, reminding us that survival is never merely physical. It is moral, social, and cultural. Across the globe, floods remain mirrors of human experience, resilience, and ethical consciousness, reflecting both the forces of nature and the enduring power of human storytelling. As we reach the culmination of this global journey through flood myths, a profound realization emerges. These stories, scattered across continents and cultures, form a mosaic of human experience, memory, and morality. From the Tigris and Euphrates to the Pacific Islands, from the Nile to the Americas, floods have shaped civilizations, tested human courage, and inspired myths that endure across millennia. They are more than cautionary tales. They are mirrors of our fears, our resilience, and our ethical consciousness. The flood, in all its forms, symbolizes both destruction and renewal. Entire cities, communities, and ways of life were wiped away, leaving only the survivors to carry knowledge, culture, and morality forward. Whether through the Mesopotamian Ark, Noah's vessel, the Indian boat of Manu, or Pacific canoes, humanity has consistently been depicted as facing overwhelming waters with courage, foresight, and moral responsibility. These stories celebrate human ingenuity and endurance, while reminding us of our fragility in the face of natural forces far greater than ourselves. Emotionally, the narratives are powerful and universal. Imagine the fear as waters rise inexorably, the uncertainty of whether one will survive, the desperation of families and communities, and the awe at witnessing nature's uncontrollable might. Yet amid despair, hope persists. Survivors carry seeds, animals, knowledge, and sacred traditions, symbols of continuity, resilience, and ethical duty. Across cultures, the emotional stakes are constant. Life is fragile, morality matters, and collective wisdom ensures survival. The flood is both a literal and symbolic crucible, testing human character and shaping civilization. Throughout history, floods have been teachers, not merely destroyers. They demand attentiveness to natural signs, cooperation among communities, and ethical behavior that balances survival with stewardship of life. Water teaches that survival is as much about morality, foresight, and cooperation as it is about physical endurance. Flood myths, therefore, are multidimensional. Historical memory, moral instruction, and emotional narrative intertwined, encoded in generations of storytelling. The global consistency of these myths is both striking and mysterious. Despite vast differences in geography, culture, and time, humans across the planet share remarkably similar stories. Overwhelming water, chosen survivors, divine or spiritual guidance, moral testing, preservation of life, and eventual renewal. From Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India to the Americas, Africa, the Pacific, and the Middle East, these narratives converge on universal truths about human existence, vulnerability, and resilience. The flood is a shared human language, a story humanity has told over and over in countless voices and forms. The possibility of lost civilizations, sunken cities, and submerged lands adds an even more enigmatic dimension. Legends of Atlantis, Lemuria, Kumari Kandam, and submerged cities across the Mediterranean and Pacific suggest that some myths may encode memories of real events. Archaeology, geology, and climate science support the notion that massive floods, rising seas, and catastrophic water events did occur, lending historical plausibility to tales once dismissed as purely allegorical. Myths may thus serve as bridges between history and memory, warning and wisdom, reality and imagination. Ethically, floods are mirrors reflecting human behavior. Hubris, greed, arrogance, or neglect often trigger catastrophe, while foresight, cooperation, and moral integrity ensure survival. Across every culture, flood narratives reinforce this lesson. Humanity's survival depends not only on ingenuity, but on ethical engagement, attentiveness, and moral responsibility. Flood myths encode ethical instruction as clearly as they preserve memory of environmental challenges, teaching generations how to navigate danger while maintaining communal and moral integrity. Psychologically, the stories resonate with universal human experience. They confront mortality, evoke awe and fear, and provide models of courage and morality. The tension between destruction and renewal, despair and hope, chaos and order, creates narratives that captivate imagination while offering emotional and ethical guidance. Water becomes both adversary and teacher, destroying yet instructing, terrifying yet inspiring. The flood myth speaks to the human need to understand, endure, and find meaning in the face of forces far greater than ourselves. In reflection, the flood is both literal and symbolic, historical and universal. It destroys and purifies, challenges and instructs, terrifies and inspires. Across the globe, humans have responded with courage, foresight, morality, and ingenuity. Stories of survival, preservation, and ethical conduct resonate across millennia, linking humanity in a shared narrative of resilience, wisdom, and hope. Every ark, every raft, every survivor in these myths carries not just life, but knowledge, culture, and moral guidance for future generations. Finally, these myths leave us with a subtle but profound question. What if these stories do more than entertain or instruct? What if they contain echoes of history, fragments of lost civilizations, and timeless lessons about our relationship with nature, ethics, and survival? The flood myths challenge us to reflect on our place in the natural world, our responsibility to one another, and the resilience embedded in human culture. They invite us to see water not merely as a destructive force, but as a teacher, a mirror, and a vessel carrying the wisdom of countless generations. As the waters recede in the stories, life endures, knowledge survives, and humanity's ethical and cultural legacy continues. The flood leaves devastation, yes, but also renewal, insight, and moral clarity. Across continents, cultures, and centuries, the flood remains an enduring symbol of humanity's vulnerability, resilience, and profound capacity for foresight, courage, and ethical action. It is a story of survival, a story of morality, and ultimately, a a story that continues to ripple through human consciousness today, challenging us to reflect, learn, and endure.